of Indonesia, IIIU continues to build infrastructure, management, faculty and library buildings, lecturer housing, dormitories, sports facilities, reforestation programs, and much, much more. We believe we can grow bigger than our dreams and hopes. We strive to continue to make improvements through various innovations, collaborations, as well as dialogue with students, lecturers, and staff in carrying out the university's vision and mission. Come to IIIU and join future leaders from various countries to seek knowledge to the ends of the earth.
Everyone has their own story and their own journey. Each person's journey is unique. They have their own set of goals. So, what is the most important part of a journey? Is it the beginning? Is it the people you meet during the journey? At the Faculty of Islamic Studies, every journey matters, and every part of that journey is priceless.
Welcome to the Faculty of Islamic Studies at the Indonesian International Islamic University.
As part of the newly established international university, aiming to position itself as one of the leading institutes for higher learning in the Muslim world by developing excellent graduate degree programs, innovative research, and vibrant socio-cultural activities, the Faculty of Islamic Studies has established a strong foundation since its inauguration in September 2021 by recruiting the best faculty members, designing innovative curriculum, and organizing numerous academic and research activities.
Our journey began with a single goal in mind: creating a better world by providing excellent education and research on Islam and society in the Muslim world. We take the first step by establishing a world-class Islamic Studies faculty, where you can experience an international environment while pursuing classical and contemporary approaches in Islamic studies. A journey is not something you should undertake alone. Along your journey, you will walk alongside others who share the same vision and goals. The Faculty of Islamic Studies is a place where students from various countries, more than 15 countries, can experience the richness and diversity of Indonesian society while living with the universal values of Islam. We care about your journey in education, and so you'll be guided by the best lecturers with numerous accomplishments and awards. They're graduates of the best universities worldwide, of both Western and Middle Eastern countries. In addition, all lecturers at the Faculty of Islamic Studies actively contribute to research and development at various institutions on a national and international scale, and you will be a part of it as well. We understand your strong desire to grow and innovate. We are constantly developing academic programs such as dual degree programs and research collaboration in cooperation with campuses in various countries, including the United Kingdom and Egypt. All programs are designed to produce Islamic studies experts who are masters in classical Islamic texts and modern social science, and you will participate directly.
Faculty of Islamic Studies at the Indonesian International Islamic University is the best place for those who wish not only to explore Islamic studies, but also to discover Islamic civilization in Indonesia and the global Muslim world that can make a positive contribution in the discovery of knowledge and the preservation of world civilization. Graduates of the Faculty of Islamic Studies are expected to advance their career in academia, research institutions, policymaking institutions, international consulting agency, diplomatic work, government sectors, and also international organizations.
You want freedom and comfort, and so do we. We provide the best facilities to help you become an active and innovative generation in all aspects of life, both academic and non-academic. You will always have enough space to grow, together. Time will always be your friend, because everything you need can be accessed whenever you want. Nothing can stop you, and the sky is the limit. We will grow continuously along the journey, helping you develop all of your intelligence. physically, mentally, and spiritually.
Hello and good morning, everyone.
By doing
Welcome to the theater of Universitas Islam Internasional Indonesia. I'd like to take a brief moment to go over a few housekeeping matters. First, a small but important request. We kindly ask you to switch your mobile phones to silent. We want to keep our full attention to our speakers and give them the respect they deserve. Second, please use the QR codes that are displayed on the monitors found at the sides of the venue to join the Wi-Fi network. And third, for your safety, please allow me to run through some of the brief emergency information. In the unlikely event of an emergency, please remain calm and follow the instructions of our committee members positioned around the theater. The nearest emergency exits are located at the rear of this hall to your left and right. Please take a moment now to identify the exit closest to you. Should an evacuation be necessary, you will hear a continuous alarm. Please proceed calmly and in an orderly manner to the nearest exit and make your way to the designated assembly point located at the parking lot of the Faculty A building. Thank you for your attention and cooperation.
Welcome to Indonesian International Islamic University. Established on June 5th, 2018. This campus is expected to be a place for the growth of faith.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Distinguished guests, esteemed faculty, respected colleagues, researchers, and students joining us today, it is my honor and privilege to welcome you to the opening ceremony of the 2026 IFAR Consortium Conference. Please allow me to introduce myself. My name is Fahrul Rinaldi, and I have the pleasure of serving as your Master of Ceremony for the next 3 days. Over the course of this conference, we will come together as a community of thinkers and scholars, all united by curiosity and driven by a shared commitment to bring fairness in the contours of inequality, power, protest, privilege in Southeast Asia. In this forum, kindly expect that we will exchange ideas, challenge assumptions, forge new collaborations, and hopefully leave here not just with new knowledge, but with new friendships and new inspiration. Before we begin our program in earnest, it is my pleasure to invite two distinguished speakers to the podium to officially open this conference. Our first speaker has worked tirelessly together with the organizing committee to bring this conference into life. It is through their vision and dedication that we are all here gathered today. So please join me in giving a warm round of applause as I invite Dr. Sirojuddin Arif, the conference convener, to the podium to deliver his welcoming remarks. The floor is yours, Dr. Arif.
Good morning, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Honorable Rector of UII and Director of IFAR UII, Honorable Directors of IFAR Atmajaya, IFAR Monash University Indonesia, IFAR SOAS LPM UI, Honorable Chair and members of the Advisory Board ISSF Indonesia, distinguished guests, speakers, presenters, moderators, and discussant, and ladies and gentlemen, welcome and thank you for attending this conference. It's my honor to welcome you to the 2026 IFAR Consortium Conference. Under the title Contours of Inequality, Power, Protest, and Privilege in Southeast Asia, the conference set out to critically examine the dynamic and patterns of inequality across the region. Indeed, Southeast Asia is a region of remarkable contrast. It is home to some of the world's fastest growing economies and most vibrant societies. But indeed, it remains marked by the deep and persistent inequality in income, wealth, and access to public services like health and education. Inequality have declined in the region during the 60s, 70s, and 80s, but after that period, it rose again since the late 80s. This trajectory offers the excellent opportunity for scholars, political scientists, political economists, sociologists, anthropologists, and all other disciplines to examine the complexity and dynamics of inequality in late capitalist development. We recognize that inequality is shaped by various factors, ranging from colonial histories, geography, and economic development, to class, ethnicity, gender, religion, and other categories. Inequality is reproduced through institutions and entrenched by privilege, yet it is also continually contested through everyday resistance, organized movements, and persistent demand by the poor and the underprivileged for their voice to be heard. We have therefore organized this conference around three related themes: power, protest, and privilege. This conference aims to scrutinize how political power and economic development have shaped inequality. We are equally keen to examine how the state, its actors and policies, religion, ethnicity, sexuality, and other categories, how they produce and reproduce inequality. We also welcome contributions that address the new challenges posed by the climate change and recent development in technology. In doing so, the conference calls for close attention not only to the origins of inequality, but also on the consequences which span from political stability, democratic quality, social cohesion, and cultural life. Understanding these linkages is especially vital in a region where economic transformation, institutional change, and deep-seated social hierarchies intersect in complex and volatile ways. We extend our sincere gratitude to our speakers, presenters, chairs, discussion partners, and all the participants, and the organizing team for making this gathering possible, and to each of you joining us today. We are also deeply grateful to the Indonesian Scholarship and Research Support Foundation for their generous support of the conference. May our conversation be rigorous and exchange respectful, and our shared commitment to a more just and equal Southeast Asia are all stronger for having met. We hope this conference will spark ideas, forge collaborations, and renew our resolve. We wish you a stimulating and rewarding few days together. Once again, welcome and thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Arif, for the heartfelt words. It is now my distinct honor to introduce our next speaker, a leader whose authority continues to guide this university towards excellence in research, education, and services to the society. Please join me in welcoming Professor Jamhari, Rector of Universitas Islam Internasional Indonesia, also the Director of the Institute for Advanced Research of UIII, who will officially declare this conference open. To Professor Jamhari, time is yours.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. A very warm welcome to each of you and good morning. It is my absolute honor on behalf of Universitas Islam Internasional Indonesia and IFAR UIII to open the 2026 IFAR Consortium Conference titled Contours of Inequality, Protest, Power and Privilege in Southeast Asia. To the scholars, professors, researchers, and friends gathered here today, we are delighted that you are here. We have gathered here today to examine one of the defining questions of our age, inequality. Inequality is not an abstraction. It shapes who can learn, work, remain healthy, and heard. It also determines whose voices carries our economies and our democracies, and whose does not. These questions are pressing everywhere, and they are appalling here in Southeast Asia, where rapid growth and persistent disparity sit side by side. A gathering of this kind is exactly the sort of forum in which rigorous research can be brought to bear on a problem that demands our most serious thinking. Before our discussion begins, allow me to offer some words of gratitude. For a conference such as this is never the work of one institution alone. I wish first to thank our generous sponsor, the Indonesian Scholarship and Research Support Foundation, ISRF's commitment to cultivating a new generation of Indonesian scholars and to building the institutions in which serious research can flourish has made this conference possible. We are deeply grateful for their support, vision, and steadfast belief in the value of scholarship for Indonesia. I also wish to warmly thank for our partners across the IFAR Consortium, whose collaboration is the foundation of this gathering. IFAR Monash Indonesia, IFAR Universitas Atma Jaya Jakarta, and IFAR LPAM Universitas Indonesia. To each of our partner institutions, thank you for your dedication and your shared purpose. Closer to home, I want to recognize the organizing team here at UIII. The faculty, fellows, and staff, together with our committee members and volunteers, have devoted many months to bringing this conference to life. The program before us, the speakers assembled, and the smooth running of these days are the result of their careful and often unseen work. On behalf of the university and on behalf of everyone gathered here, I thank you most sincerely. Most of all, I wish to welcome the scholars and professors who will speak over the course of this conference. You have traveled here to share research that has demanded years of careful effort. The papers, panels, and conversation ahead represent the very best of what an academic community can offer. Evidence brought to bear on difficult questions and ideas sharpened in the company of peace. We are honored by your presence and look forward to learning from you. With that, it is my privilege to declare the 2026 IFAR Consortium Conference officially open. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you, Professor Jamhari, for those inspiring words and officially commencing the 2026 IFAR Consortium Conference. With that, the conference is officially underway. So to continue our agenda, it is time to turn to heart of why we are here gathered today, the keynote speech. Today, Professor Vivek Chibber from the Department of Sociology, New York University, will be speaking to us on the topic titled, What Was Industrial Policy?, chaired by Dr. Sirojuddin Arif. So without further ado, please join me giving a warm welcome to Prof. Chibber and Dr. Arif to the stage. The time is yours.
Excuse me. Good morning, everyone. Honored guests, distinguished speakers, presenters, discussion, and all participants. Once again, welcome to UI3, and thank you for joining us today. It is my privilege to chair these opening sessions. For the next 90 minutes, we'll turn to one of the most contested subjects in economic development, which is industrial policy, which is question about how states should actively, whether states should actively pick winners, promote specific sectors on which their economies should turn on, and if it is the case, how should states do that? This question is not new, but the terms of the debate has shifted very significantly. For much of the 80s and 90s, industrial policy is treated as settled error. Governments, this argument went on, could not pick winners, and attempts to do so invited capture and waste. The consensus that day, the consensus has collapsed today. As you know, that semiconductor subsidies, green industrial strategies, critical mineral policy, and export restriction on raw material are now standard instruments for many countries, in developing countries as well as developed ones. And the scale of this shift is very striking. A recent World Bank report, Industrial Policy for Development, which reviewed the latest national development plan across 183 economies, found that governments around the world are increasingly turning to industrial policy. Developing countries are in fact the heaviest users. Low-income economies target growth in 13 industries on average, more than twice the number in high-income economies. And business subsidies in upper middle-income economies now average 4.2 average of GDP, the highest on our record. So what was heterodox a decade ago now is close to conventional. This reversal raises very hard questions about industrial policy rather than settling them. Which conditions distinguish the cases that work from the many that didn't? Who bears the cost when industrial policy fails, and who captures the gains when it succeeds? For many countries in South Asia, which have been shaped by community dependence, uneven industrialization, and now the pressure for decarbonization and automation, what does industrial policy actually look like? So we are lucky today, we have a perfect guest to address these questions, Professor Vivek Chibber. He is Professor of Sociology at New York University. His work spans economic sociology, development, Marxian theory, and comparative historical sociology. He is the founding editor of Catalyst, a journal of theory and strategy. Professor Chibber is the author of 3 major books: Locked in Place, State Building and Late Industrialization in India, Postcolonial Theory and Spectre of Capital, and the Class Metric, Social Theory After the Cultural Turn. His first book, Locked in Place, received the 2005 Barrington Moore Book Award from the Comparative Historical section of the American Sociological Associations. Professor Chibber will speak for roughly 45 minutes, after which we will open for questions. You can submit your questions using the link provided by the organizing committee. The link will be shown on the screen. So you can submit your questions using this link. I'll put some of them to Professor Chibber directly, or I'll invite you to ask your question in person. So without further ado, please join me to welcome Professor Chibber to the stage.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. And I would like to especially thank Ciro for organizing this and for inviting me, but the committee as well, and everybody who's in the room today. This is my first time to Indonesia, and it's been wonderful so far. So it's, I hope I don't disappoint in the talk that's coming about for you. When I was invited to the talk, I was asked to speak on some relevant topic having to do with development inequality and the Global South. And it seems to me that Industrial policy is something that is relevant not only because it brings all of these matters together, but because it is also now in the air once again after a hiatus of many, many years. And I thought it would be interesting to explore what exactly it is, where it came from, what its prospects are, and what to make of it today in this world as we move on into, hopefully, a new era. Now, oops. Okay, something's going wrong here. I have to go back. This is going backwards, so I'm not figuring this out. There, it's over. I hope you enjoyed it. Somebody has to tell me how to work this thing, because it is moving in the... It's gone now. So there's only... Oh, I see what I... There's 2 errors. Hang on. Okay, so now let me see if I can get this. Okay. The context in which industrial policy has come up today is very different from the last time that it was a major issue. And the last time in development studies that it was a major issue was in the mid-1990s. And interestingly, the World Bank itself came up with a report called the East Asian Miracle. And this report was a landmark event because even while it continued with the World Bank's basic orientation, which was that development should be market-oriented and should avoid an extensively interventionist state, it did have to accept, at least grudgingly, that the Northeast Asian miracle economies, primarily Korea and Taiwan, but then also some of the Southeast Asian economies that had done well, had relied to a great extent on state intervention. And the report had to go through all kinds of somersaults to both acknowledge that state intervention occurred and was not entirely disastrous, but at the same time keep to the orthodoxy that it should nevertheless be avoided. Now that was the mid-1990s, and that was the moment at which development studies was taking a turn. Under the influence of some very, very important works by scholars like Robert Wade and Alice Amsden, it was taking a turn where it was discovered and argued to great effect that not only was state intervention a regular feature of East Asian success in their development, but was a foundation for that success. In the interim, the scholarly world deepened this argument and indeed confirmed it in many, many ways. Now, the irony, of course, is this was happening exactly at the moment when liberalization in the developing world was at its peak. Just as the East Asian Miracle Report comes out, we see that across Latin America, South Asia, and in the East Asian miracle economies themselves, the developmental state and all the institutions of liberalization were being rolled back. So not surprisingly, just as the Bretton Woods institutions acknowledged the importance of industrial policy, the actual practice of industrial policy starts to wane. So how is it that today we find the topic coming back? Well, not only has it come back, the World Bank has a very different attitude towards it. It's come back largely now because the advanced world is moving towards some sort of practice of state intervention. And because of the enormous influence that the United States and Europe has on the bank, lo and behold, the bank not only publishes now in 2026 a report on industrial policy and its revival, but is largely, as Ciro said, supportive of it. So it looks like something that was taken off the agenda for a quarter century is now back on the agenda. Okay, now let me see if I can work this. So in this talk, I want to address 4 questions. First of all, what exactly is industrial policy? Secondly, what were the conditions that gave rise to it? Where did it come from? Fourthly, what were the variables, the factors that determined whether it was successful or not? Because it is indeed the case that it was not always uniformly successful. And having then explored this historical lineage of industrial policy, we want to ask the burning question for today, which is, What are the prospects for its success today, and what forms should it take if we are to return back to it in the sort of way we did in the post-war era? So let's just start with the definition. What is industrial policy? Well, there are two basic components of this approach to development. One is that industrial policy seeks to protect local firms from international competition. The reason for that is that it is perceived that because local firms are uncompetitive, either because the country is just starting its path to industrialization or because the country is losing an edge that it used to have, because of that, those firms cannot effectively compete against international rivals. And so in order to give them the space, the ability to build up their productive capacities, there needs to be some kind of attenuation, some kind of lessening of that international competition. And so they're given all sorts of protections from it, mainly through things like tariffs, but also through things like exchange rate manipulation and interest rate manipulation. This is the protective aspect of industrial policy. This is complemented by its second essential component, which is various forms of subsidies which lower the price of inputs so that firms may be able to then hothouse their investment process. The idea is that the protections and the tariffs clear out international rivals and create a space for firms to develop their capacities, and then the subsidies accelerate the process by which they can develop managerial skills, acquire new technology, learn how to use that technology, create the skills that their workforce needs, et cetera, et cetera. Something that would take decades to achieve is hoped to be achievable in a matter of a few years. Okay, so these were the measures that were essential to industrial policy, but understood to be temporary. The idea was not to create a forever world in which local firms are protected and subsidized, but to have it be an island, a brief moment in history so that they can gather up their abilities and then throw them out onto the global economy so that they may compete effectively. Now, not surprisingly, industrial policy was primarily practiced in the developing world because this was the area in which manufacturing was not yet very much developed and in which it was felt that unless they're given a chance to build their capacities, the firms in these countries will forever be uncompetitive in relation to the advanced world. But it should be understood that there's nothing intrinsic in industrial policy that confines it to the developing world. Since the principle is to allow firms to build their capabilities to better compete on the global market, you can also see it being practiced in advanced countries. When? Well, when firms in those advanced countries, which once had a competitive edge, find themselves losing that competitive edge to new rivals or firms or countries, that is, in which firms are developing their capabilities faster. So you can have, and you have had, industrial policy in both parts of the world, both in the global south and, for example, right now, in Europe and in the United States, because it's perceived that they are falling behind relative to newcomers, of course, primarily China. Now, the problem with industrial policy, its central contradiction, was that the very instruments that were used to promote industrialization also had the potential of undermining that very goal. The very instruments, that is tariff protection and subsidies, that were essential to industrial policy had this one problem, which is that they were intended to make firms more competitive. But precisely the fact of attenuating and reducing the competitive threat from rivals eased the pressure on local firms to build their competitive capacities. What was happening with the industrial policy was, because the global rivals were being warded off from the local market, the very importance and the centrality of building up their competitive edge was lessened on local firms because they were essentially given free and easy profits. Since international competition was no longer a factor, firms locally, even if they were uncompetitive, even if they did not emphasize efficiency were able to capture local markets with relative ease. Now, that meant that implementing industrial policy also ended up creating the conditions for its failure. States, therefore, had no alternative but to try to develop instruments to ward off or to block firms' inclination to accept the subsidies, to accept the free profits, and then refuse to upgrade their equipment, refuse to adopt best practice technologies because they didn't need to, because the profits were coming in for free. So how could states avert that outcome? They did it, or they tried to do it, by developing administrative capacities, institutions within the state that had the job of monitoring those firms and then sanctioning them in the event that they did not use the subsidies in the way they were intended. So alongside the adoption of industrial policy, you had in the post-war era a decades-long process of state building, of institution building, because without those newly created institutions that might be able to monitor and sanction, that is to say, discipline local firms, there was a live chance that those subsidies that were being given to them would be frittered away or used in ways that were not initially intended. This set up a conflictual process between those firms and the state. What states found, state managers found, was that firms were very, very happy to accept all the gifts that were being given by the state, but at the same time to reject or to struggle against the insistence on discipline and the insistence on using the subsidies as intended. Now, why would they do this? What happens in the developing countries is, precisely because the markets are protected through tariffs, there's a big incentive to take the monies that are coming through cheap loans, cheap credit, easy inputs, and to then reallocate them to other lines and other sectors to capture what's called first mover advantage. If I'm being given money to start up a new, let's say, auto plant, but I also know that it's possible for me to acquire monopoly rights and first mover advantage in building, say, machine tools, what I do is take the money that's being given for auto, redeploy it towards machine tools, and now I have a first mover advantage or monopoly presence in both sectors rather than just one. The reason I don't have to worry about losing advantage in auto is that it's already been protected from international competition, and I don't have any local domestic rivals. So the lesson that states everywhere learned was that what firms were looking for was not laissez-faire. They were not looking for a free market economy. They were looking for one component of industrial policy while rejecting the second. They were looking for all the subsidies, all the gifts coming in from the state, but very resistant to the demand for reciprocity. Very resistant to the demand for then abiding by the priorities that the planners and the state managers had accorded, and instead reallocating them towards their own priorities and their own the sense of where the money would be best used. This was a direct consequence of the dilemma of protectionism, the dilemma of closing off competition. And interestingly, the two countries where you saw the most success of industrial policy, Korea and Taiwan, were successful precisely because the states managed to not simply give firms easy access to local monopolies and easy profits. What they had the firms successfully do was take the subsidies and then commit to highly competitive markets where they would be forced to use them in ways that enhanced their capabilities. These were, of course, export markets. Now, for very specific reasons, and highly contingent reasons, Korea and Taiwan were different from most of the other developing countries in that in these countries, instead of committing simply to import substitution and growing in the domestic market, Korean and Taiwanese firms committed to what's called export-led industrialization. Export-led industrialization means that their investment practices were primarily geared towards the export markets in the United States and to a lesser extent Europe, not primarily geared towards capturing the domestic market. Whereas in countries where there was more of an emphasis on import substitution, the freedom or the lack of exposure to export markets made it easier for them to not worry about competitiveness. In other words, what export-led industrialization did was that it exposed local firms to cutthroat competition. Because they were exposed to cutthroat competition, they actually needed the coordination that came through state discipline. Whereas countries like India, Turkey, Egypt had firms that were rejecting state discipline and state coordination and state directives, Korean and Taiwanese firms needed it. And the reason they needed it was when they were trying to compete in export markets, they needed to make sure that inputs coming from upstream firms and linkages to downstream firms were actually timely, effective, and well coordinated. If they had been left to the free market and firms' own decisions, they might have happened, they might have come about, but would have done so in a way that was much slower, less predictable, and more risky than it was through the coordinating hand of the state. And so what export-led industrialization did was it made firms need the state. Well, these were the two universes of industrial policy in the post-war world. Most countries, middle-income countries that resorted to it, succeeded but moderately well because a fair proportion of the gifts and subsidies that they were giving to the firms did in fact go waste, did not in fact go towards upgrading their equipment. While the miracle economies of Korea, of Taiwan, did much better because of these competitive pressures on them. Regardless, overall, it was a success. Even amongst countries like Turkey, India, it did succeed in creating an industrial base, albeit at a slower pace and with less global efficiency than in the miracle economies. So discipline was only partial, but it did succeed to an appreciable extent, more so than any other strategy in the global south had in the century preceding it. Well, the political foundations of developmentalism and industrial policy were essentially this partnership between the state and local capitalists. But just as the entire era of industrial policy and developmentalism had political foundations, so did what replaced it, which is the neoliberal era. Now, the reason I'm stressing this is there's a kind of a current, you might even think of it as an orthodoxy, inside development studies, which looks at the onset of neoliberalism and globalization in the South as something that was imposed by the West, as something that was imposed by the advanced countries through the Bretton Woods institutions, through institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. Countries would fall into debt, they would have a payments crisis, the IMF would come in, it would give them a loan, and in exchange for the loan, it would be demanded that they liberalize, that they free up their markets, and they allow firms from Europe and the United States to come in, whereas they had been thrown out in the era of import substitution. Now, empirically, it is true that Bretton Woods institutions did come in with a great many demands to liberalize. But it's important to understand that this is not something that started in the 1980s and 90s, which is the era that we associate with neoliberalism. In fact, Bretton Woods institutions had been pressing for liberalization ever since the late 60s, accelerating in pace and increasing in intensity through the 1970s. The IMF came in several occasions in Latin America, in South Asia, in the Middle East, and provided loans with demands for austerity, with demands for liberalization. And the response on the part of these developing countries would be, in fact, as long as the Bretton Woods advisors were in the country, do some liberalization, to change their exchange rates, to change monetary policy. But the moment the advisors went back and the payments crisis was averted, the countries would go back to import substitution, back to industrial policy. Why? Well, the reason was that no policy could remain stable as an economic policy unless it had domestic sources of support. The World Bank can come in, the IMF can come in and make demands, but it has to leave. And once it leaves, what the state does is going to depend on what the local elites the local politically powerful classes are demanding of it. And through the 60s and 70s, there was the most important constituency inside these countries that were developing, which is the industrial class and the business class, was still very deeply committed to the free profits, the easy profits, the cheap credits, and the easy existence that import substitution and protection provided to it. This is why to accord primacy to the Bretton Woods institutions is, I think, an analytical error. They could be a trigger for promoting liberalization, but they were never the fundamental cause. The fundamental cause was the growth of a local constituency that started to see a more liberalized economy in being in its own interests. And this did not really develop until well into the 1980s. What was this constituency? Well, it was two kinds. One was the largest firms inside these countries, while being happy with the easy conditions of the industrial policy and planning era, did in fact see limits to their own growth unless they were able to go into the global market and unless they were able to get cheaper capital goods from industrial countries. Their problem was that they were trying to build up some degree of their capacities over time, but the very inefficiency of local firms also meant high-cost, unproductive capital goods. And there was no chance they could ever compete on the global market without cheaper inputs and cheaper capital goods, which required easing up the tariff, the barriers to the entry of foreign goods, which included foreign capital goods. So on the one hand, you had a domestic capital class that was trying to now, that saw itself as having developed well enough and was powerful enough to actually contemplate entering global markets. Secondly, precisely because they were now endowed with greater abilities, in spite of being slower in developing them, those greater abilities meant they did not need to tolerate a regulatory and interventionist state anymore. It's important to understand, firms always wanted the subsidies, but they never wanted the more disciplinary interventions of the state. But states, even when they were not as effective as Korea and Taiwan, did introduce and evolve just such instruments of regulation, monitoring, even if they didn't work very well. Firms grudgingly accepted them because they were part of the overall package. But once those firms thought they no longer needed them, you saw them pushing back with greater vigor against the interventionist state. There's no place where this happens more aggressively than Korea itself. By the 1990s, Korean chaebol were saying, we do not want the old-style Korean interventionism that we had in the 70s and 80s because we no longer need it. You saw this happening in India. You see it happening in South America. The largest firms in these countries are now pushing back against the more protectionist and the more interventionist states. So by the mid-1980s, Mexico, Argentina, Brazil, India, of course, Korea, in all these countries, there is a local constituency that is now quite interested and supportive of a liberalizing agenda. Now when the IMF comes in, now when the World Bank comes in and says you must liberalize, state managers find that there's a local constituency that's saying the same thing. That's saying, yes, we must liberalize. And whereas in the 70s, you had episodes of liberalization and then going back to a protected regimes, in the 90s you find liberalization sticks. It doesn't get reversed, and it starts moving on. So the political foundations of globalization and liberalization in the South were a transformation of its own domestic industrial class and domestic business elite, which means it's not going to go away on its own. You're not going to have an era where if the United States stops pressuring these countries to liberalize, they will go back to where they used to be, because there is no powerful constituency in these countries anymore that, as there was in the 40s and 50s, which wants the kind of developmental partnership that you had back in the post-war era. So this means that if industrial policy does come back, it's not going to be the same as it was in the post-war years. Firms are always happy to take subsidies, everywhere. There's no country in which they will refuse cheap inputs, protection by the state. There's no country in which they will refuse all kinds of cheap loans and cheap credit. The issue is, will they also accept the second component of industrial policy, which is the coordination, monitoring, and discipline on the part of the state? Because capitalists as a group in the global south no longer feel they need the coordinating capacities of the state, they will be happy to accept industrial policy of a certain kind, which is what in colloquially we call the nanny state. The more sophisticated term for this is indicative planning. Planning has been falls into two categories in a capitalist economy in the post-war era. There was something called indicative planning and there was something called directive planning. Directive planning is what I've been talking about as industrial policy and planning in which you not only try to help your local business firm, but you try to direct the flows of investment from one direction to the other. The less demanding form of industrial policy is one in which you simply give firms their subsidies and then you try to help them achieve their own ends rather than having them change their ends. This is called indicative planning. It was practiced in some of the advanced world in the 50s and 60s. And what set it apart from directive planning was precisely the absence of discipline. The state was simply a helping hand to the capitalist class. What you see happening today in the United States, in Europe, in the return of industrial policy is much more of an emphasis simply on helping local firms achieve their own ends rather than redirecting those firms into desired channels, channels which may not accord with or correspond to the firm's own priorities. The difficulty of industrial policy today will be that even in the West and also in the South, firms are, as they always are, willing to accept subsidies and assistance, but not the discipline. That's the first challenge of industrial policy in this era. The second challenge is this. Neoliberalism was not simply a moment when economies were freed up, when regulations were rolled back. It was also an era in which states were dismantled. So once firms in the South gave up their marriage, their fixation on developmentalism and adopted a globalizing, liberalizing agenda, those same firms also started putting pressures on states to dismantle their planning agencies, dismantle their administrative institutions which had been endowed with the ability to raise funds, to monitor, to sanction, etc. So where we are today is a situation in which if you were to try to move towards industrial policy of a directive kind, of a kind that actually pushes firms into new sectors, you would have to engage in a new process of state building, just as you had in the 40s and 50s. Those institutions, those administrative agencies that had been kind of put out to pasture in the 80s no longer exist. They will have to be built again from scratch. And precisely because firms are no longer feel that they have to put up with these disciplinary institutions, with the administrative agencies of the state, the problem is that those apparatuses will have to be built all over again. So the two problems you face is that, first of all, in the global south, in countries like India, Brazil, Mexico, leading firms do not any longer feel like they need the state the way they did in the 50s and 60s. And secondly, the states themselves are much weaker. So you'll have to rebuild the institutions you had before. What are you likely to find? You're likely to find that industrial policy will be indicative, simply, in other words, a helping hand, a nanny state, rather than a more directive state. If you look at the CHIPS Act in the United States, if you look at what's called the Green New Deal, they're mostly subsidizing efforts. They do not come with a great deal of conditionalities. On paper, they do, but it's not clear to what extent firms have actually been following them. Now, the difficulty of knowing the extent to which industrial policy in the US today or in Europe is actually directive is the Trump interregnum right now is just unique. Trump is so disruptive and so, I would say, mercurial, that state agencies have been derailed from their tasks in a way that makes it impossible to know whether those tasks are being undermined because of resistance from firms, or if it's being undermined because the state itself is dismantling them. But I think what you will find over the years is that where industrial policy is returning, it's largely supportive and not very disciplinary. But there's another question that we need to think, which is, even if Biden-esque or the new kinds of industrial policies in the West that the World Bank is now supporting, even if they are promulgated with some degree of efficiency, do they deserve public support? The reason I'm raising it is this. What subsidies and cheap credit are is essentially public monies, taxpayer money, being handed over to private profit-maximizing firms. And what this means is that the firms are in many ways having some of the risks of investment being socialized, because they're not having to raise the money themselves. They're not having to go and acquire inputs themselves, which is costly. Those costs are being reduced. But the profits are still entirely up to the dispersal and the wishes of the firms themselves. One way to put it is that what industrial policy of a non-directive, of an indicative kind is doing is socializing their risks while allowing them to privatize and privately appropriate all the profits. Now, the question is this something that the public should support? Is this something that in a democratic society we should be supportive of, which is for private actors to be given access to public monies without any kind of obligations on their part as to what they do with that money, without any kind of obligation on their part to the public good as a condition for acquiring those monies? At the very minimum, I would say, in a democratic country, in a democratic polity, these funds should come with some kind of agreements on the part of the firms as to what they will do with it, much as the principles of directive planning in the 40s and 50s. The money should come with an insistence that the firms agree to certain labor rights, that they agree to certain environmental regulations, that they agree to certain conditions of work and upgrading the conditions of work for their employees as a part of the agreement on access to those monies. Now, this was part of the motivation in the 40s and 50s as well. These were newly democratizing countries, not just newly developing countries. And there was public pressure to make sure that whatever money was going to these firms would also be reciprocated in some way with obligations on their part. I think those principles today are going to be as valid as they were back then. And this brings us back to the problem, therefore, of discipline. Even today, if you're going to have industrial policy, there is going to be massive public pressure for that policy to come with conditions that are imposed on the firms. The problem is, this is not Brazil of 1950, India of 1955. Industrial policy is coming back not just in the global south, but also primarily right now at this moment in the United States and Europe. And firms in the United States and Europe, private firms, are much more powerful than firms had been in the 40s and 50s in the global south. And if they are not interested in reciprocating in exchange for the loans that they're getting, their ability to fight back, to block state initiatives towards reciprocity is much, much greater than it was for firms in developing countries in the post-war era. So we're stuck with two possibilities, or rather one possibility, which is you can have industrial policy, but it's going to be policy that is largely supportive and not very demanding of those firms, which basically means public monies are going to be used towards private ends. Now, the promise, of course, is that if those monies do in fact result in more chips being produced in the United States, in better AI, you're going to have faster growth, and that faster growth means a tide that lifts all boats. More jobs, better wages, more income growth for labor and the employees. But that's largely an artifact of the free market ideologies of the 80s and 90s. What we have seen over the past 2 generations in the advanced world, especially in the United States, is that you've had growth, you've had a decent pace of investment, but wages, in fact, have stagnated for 2 generations. And wealth accumulation has increased. So the entire idea that we just throw money at the private sector, hope that they invest it, and that investment will mean better standards of living and increasing welfare for the general population is largely been shown to be a fallacy. And therefore, we come back that if public monies are being redirected towards these firms, it should come with some guarantees, some kind of political exchange between labor and capital, such that the reinvestment also comes with guaranteed improvements across the board for the employees and for the general population. The challenge is, how do you do it? How will you get a reluctant business community, even a hostile business community, to agree to such reciprocities? So I'll close with a couple of ideas, a couple of suggestions as to how you might make sure that firms minimally use the monies in the ways intended, but maximally also bring with those reinvestments some kinds of guarantees for employees and for the general population. Well, one is you learn from Korea and Taiwan, and today I think China is employing the same principle. One is Korea and Taiwan were able to get their local firms to agree to the state's coordination and the state's disciplining, because without it, they would not have been able to survive in the highly competitive markets of the United States. One way to get local firms, even in countries like the United States, to agree to discipline is, instead of blocking off international competition, which is the first pole, the first pillar of industrial policy, you in fact invite it in. You let the Chinese firms come in. You let European, German firms come in. You let Korean automakers come in. By, in fact, encouraging, or rather discouraging, tariffs. Once you allow that international competition come in, you have in fact created a competitive threat for your local firms. They know that they cannot survive the pressure and the threat from these foreign entrants. Once they now have to compete, in this case in their domestic market rather than export markets, they have good reason to accept state subsidies and state coordination as a condition for their survival. And once they're vulnerable to the state, once the state is able to actually promise something that they desperately need, it gives planners, industrial policy managers leverage, where they say, fine, here's what we're going to do. You line up for our subsidies. You 6 firms line up for the subsidies. We will give the subsidies to those firms that we think are best endowed and best positioned to use these subsidies, to use our assistance in productive ways, and then we'll monitor you. And if you manage, if you use them in the ways as directed, we'll renew them. We'll give it to you again 2 years from now. But if you refuse to do so, the queue, we go to the next person in line. Essentially, this is something like what China has been doing for 25 years. China has actually allowed a very intense domestic competition coming from foreign capital and trying to promote competition from its firms inside the country by its firms, largely because it's a continental-sized economy. It can actually have a very competitive, very vibrant domestic market of its own. And then essentially, instead of administratively picking winners randomly, which is what the World Bank caricature is, what it does is to see which firms are actually performing well, and then it hothouses the further development of those firms through its subsidies. Something like that could also be adopted in the United States and Europe. Now, the thing about that is it means changing dramatically the current policy of going along with tariffs, protecting the domestic market, and then offering subsidies. This ends up making some of the same mistakes that the developing world was making in the 40s and 50s. And it's actually easier to achieve than Korea and Taiwan because they have to push their firms into these very competitive markets. All you have to do in the current world is simply lift the tariffs. You don't have to do much. Just lift the tariffs, let foreign competition come in, and then you start partnering up with local firms. This gives the state the kind of leverage that the Korean and Taiwanese states had in the 60s and 70s. Now, that's one recommendation. The problem with it, of course, is that while it solves the investment problem, it does nothing for the distribution problem. It does nothing directly for the interests of employees, of the larger community. It does nothing for general income growth in the population. So what might be another alternative? Well, the other alternative for the industrial policy today is to change the governing coalition, is to change the alliance that oversees it. All industrial policy and planning in the post-war world was a partnership between the state and capital. In the Global South, it was a partnership between the state and the local industrialist class because both entities wanted to see a rapid industrialization process. Labor was largely marginalized. It was given some space within the political arena, but extremely small, and its hands were largely tied. And so labor was largely dependent on the state's support for things like wage increases, minimum wages, works councils, and even collective bargaining. The result was that, ironically, even while industrialists developed their capacities over the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, the trade union movement in these countries remained quite weak because it largely depended on state support and not on its own mobilizing power, not on its own strength on the ground. One possibility today, particularly in the West, but even in some countries, and I think in the Global South, is to flip the equation. Whereas my first suggestion is for the state to acquire leverage over capital by allowing in foreign competition, the second strategy would be to acquire leverage over capital through a mobilized citizenry, through a labor-led coalition for democratic rights and for greater inclusion in the economic sphere, primarily saying that if firms are going to be given subsidies that is public tax revenue money belonging to the public, those firms then also have an obligation to the public to do what? To allow for greater trade unionization, to allow for more collective bargaining, to allow for more workers' rights at the workplace, and for agreements around social welfare and generally what we call social insurance. This does not have to make those firms uncompetitive. The core of the social democratic project in Europe from the 1930s all the way into the 80s and 90s was something called the political exchange between labor and capital. And part of that political exchange was for labor to work with capital to upgrade its abilities, much as industrial policy seeks to do. But capital had to agree on reciprocating to the labor movement by committing that every increase in productivity also resulted in increases in wages. Every uptick in economic growth was also corresponding with an uptick in taxation, which was then used for redistribution through social insurance. This was made possible because of what's called the power resources of the labor movement. This is not so easy to do in the Global South right now, but it's also not impossible. And it is definitely possible in the Western countries, in the advanced countries where industrial policy is coming back. These, therefore, this second leg of the strategy would be based on flipping the ruling coalition from one that was centered around the state and capital to one where the state is linked in the first instance to labor, and then it uses the leverage that labor provides it for something I would call social democratic developmentalism. Social democratic rather than capital-based developmentalism. Is this possible? We don't know. But it is important to learn the lessons from the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. The first lesson is discipline and the ability to discipline firms is the core of the issue. Every state can give largesse. Every state can be captured, and every state can give lots of free money to the local businesses and become what I call the nanny state. But without the discipline, without monitoring and sanctions, much of that money goes waste, and it does very little for the general population. Secondly, even if that money goes towards growth, even if it's invested and used in the way stipulated by the firms, it does not solve the problem of distribution and inequality. To address those problems, it's not enough to simply give money to investors and hope that the rising tide will lift all boats. You have to give the boats equipment. You have to be able to make sure that when the tide is rising, the boats are in fact able to ride it. And the fundamental constraint on industrial policy, therefore, is not technical, it's political. The Bretton Woods institutions and much of the economics profession always treated industrial policy as if it was a technical matter, getting the right coefficients, lining up savings with investment, getting the exchange rates right, getting the interest rates right. All that is important. But at rock bottom, once it's understood that in order to make it successful, you have to exercise some kind of power over businesses, it immediately becomes political. And if that's the case, it is a political decision today whether or not this returned industrial policy is going to be one that's essentially oriented towards the interests of business and the owner's class, or it's going to be one that actually tackles both questions, growth and distribution, at the same time. Even though we are in a neoliberal world, there are many ways in which labor is today positioned to take advantage and to rewrite the rules so that the industrial policy that comes back will not be one that is simply another wrinkle of the neoliberal era. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your thorough overview of the development of industrial policy from the past to current era. I really like your last part when you talk about the possibilities of the people from the global south to take the benefit from the policy. And I think it's good time to explore more about this point. But before that, I think it's good to explore more about the political situations which was created with the current situation of industrial policy. Here is my question. You say that the situation has changed very much from the late, let's say, 70s and 80s, in which we have industrial state. Now, actually, it's difficult for the state to discipline even the capital. The capital comes from the global capital right now, right? So, what do you think? What happened actually? Who takes the most benefit from the policy? Especially if you see that there is capital, the state, and labor. How this current situation changed the constellation between these actors, and whom do you think that will take the most benefit from the current situation? You know that actually now, I think many people are very happy when they say that their governments, we developed this policy with the help of this country, including Indonesia. We have industrial policies in mining and so on. And I think in many African countries, I hear that they really like to follow the step taken by Indonesia. But actually with this happening, who do you think, who take most of the benefit from the policy? And how this changed the political constellation between these actors?
Yeah, I think there's no question that since the 1980s, what policy shifts have occurred have overwhelmingly favored the wealthy as against the general population, and especially the working population, the labor, and in countries like Indonesia, the peasantry. There's no question about that. All the data shows that globally, while growth has occurred, the occurrence of growth has been coinciding with a shrink in the share of wages in the national economy and an increase in the share of profits, which largely means that capital is able to garner all the fruits of growth, and labor has found its share of whatever growth is occurring shrinking and slowing down. Now, that's partly been masked by a rather accelerated development of a new middle class in many of these countries, including Indonesia. And that middle class has been a very vocal and supportive political and social base for neoliberalism. But even that middle class is now finding its fortunes dwindling. In India right now, if you look, highest rates of unemployment in India are among entrants into the labor force who have a college degree. So whereas college education was always seen as a means to get a pretty guaranteed upward mobility, this is no longer the case, even in a country like India. And so within the middle classes, there's an increasing skepticism towards neoliberalism. I don't want to exaggerate because largely the middle classes are quite supportive of it, but even that is now shrinking. So we're in a situation across the world right now where we haven't seen the levels of inequality that we're witnessing in the past 100, 120 years. And that's especially true in the West, where for 70 years you saw a shrinking of the gap between the wealthy and the working population. You've seen from the 80s an increase in that gap. Now, that's also a challenge for industrial policy, because it's easy for me to say, well, we should have a social democratic industrial policy. That's going to require a lot of pressure from labor for that to happen. But labor is flat on its back. It's just a fact. All over the world, labor is completely powerless right now to do very much at all. So partly what I'm calling for is it's a call for intellectuals, for activists, for organizers who throw themselves into revitalizing what was the pillar of, I think, redistribution and social advance in the 20th century, which was labor.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Chibber. So, of course, this is not for me, but this is for all the participants. So, well, I asked Professor Chibber, so please write your questions if you have questions, or maybe later on I'll invite you to ask the question in person. So, one more question, Professor Chibber. During the 80s, the developmental state, the industrialization created labor, increased the number of labor. But now you have seen that we don't see that part. And actually, in terms of the wealth distribution, it is from this labor, actually, from the present labor, that now state in Western European state, they develop a welfare state. Now, with the retrenchment of the labor, right, how is it possible, actually, that the benefit of the policy will go to the people?
If I had the answer to that question, I wouldn't be here. I'd be someplace else. Let me say this. There's two things have happened. Let's separate the global north from the global south. What's happened in the global south over the past 40 years is, in fact, the place of the urban working class has actually grown enormously in Southeast Asia, in South America, and in the Middle East. In 1980, the year you talk about, if you looked at the occupational distribution in the countries in South America and even Southeast Asia, you would find that it wasn't that different from 1940. You had about 40 to 55% of the labor force was in agriculture. And the urban working class was about 18, 20%, varying. If you look today, in Southeast, Indonesia is a bit of an outlier. It has more agricultural presence. But if you look in many countries in Southeast Asia, in South America and the Middle East, the proportion of the labor force that's in agriculture is now down to the low single digits, or even so the low double digits, or even the single digits. So actually, you've had an increase of what you would call the working class in those parts of the world. So it hasn't been a retrenchment in that sense, the way you just said. What there has been in the north is a decline in the proportion of the labor force in unions, so a declining union density. And that's very important. What's happened in these countries where there's been depeasantization in the South, South America, Middle East, and Asia, is that while you've had a potential increase in the potential manufacturing labor force as they've come in from rural areas, urban manufacturing investment has not kept up. And the result has been you haven't followed the example of the first generation of late developers at the turn of the 19th, 20th century, which was Prussia and France, and to a lesser extent even Italy, which is that rural workers or peasants being thrown out of the agricultural sector come to the cities and they find jobs. And as they find jobs, you find that the labor movement explodes. What's happened instead is what Mike Davis called a planet of slums. India is the perfect example of this, as is Brazil. They come to the cities and they cannot find any kind of meaningful employment, and so they kind of just circulate in the informal sector as gig work. The reason that's important politically is that we found it's virtually impossible to organize these workers into a trade union movement for obvious reasons. They're migrant workers, they're extremely easy to fire, they live in desperately difficult conditions, and it's very, very difficult to bring them together. So, for a social democratic turn of industrial policy, Europe is actually better positioned. Because even while there's been a decline in the trade union density, it's still quite high in many of the countries. In the South, there's the puzzle of what to do about this ocean of the semi-employed. That puzzle, I think, only has one answer to it, which is that you not only have to have a return to industrial policy, it cannot centrally rely on private investment. It has to have a major component of public investment, massive increases in public investment, because without that, the current path of accumulation, relying on private capital, has already been in place for 25, 30 years, and it's shown that it is not generating the level of employment in South America and in South Asia and the Middle East that is needed to actually do something about these oceans of slums that we have and informal sector employment that we have.
So I think that's really crucial for the future of employment and poverty inequality in the global South. And related to this point, I think from technology, I have on my list some very good questions, but I think let me invite the participant to state the question directly to you in person. Let me invite first three persons to ask this question. Edo Andrese, Rizmi Nahar Ihamullah, and Colin Zhang. Please introduce yourself briefly and state your questions. Edo Andrese? Yes.
Thank you very much for your keynote speech. It was very stimulating and inspiring. My name is Edo Andres, and I'm a professor of development geography at Seoul National University in Korea. And my question is about the implications of your talk for the technology transfer. Because we have seen in the global South, including in Southeast Asia, many foreign investors came to Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, other countries. But in many ways, there has been a lack of technology transfer to the local companies, the bigger ones, but also the small and medium enterprises. So could you elaborate a little bit about perhaps route 1 and route 2 for what could be done in order to promote upgrading for the local firms and especially the smaller ones, because that also would create employment and transfer the employment from the informal sector to the formal sector. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I think there are two prongs to the solution for technology transfer. One is that when foreign investment comes into a country, those firms are not eager to make their blueprints and their technology available to their local partners or to local firms. So they can come in through joint ventures, but in the joint ventures, there's usually some sort of written agreement as to what degree of technology sharing there will be, and the foreign firms try to keep that technology sharing to a minimum. But even if they're coming in their own, and you try to do reverse engineering, where you try to unpack their technology, they're going to try their best not to make it available for obvious reasons. So here, the state's role is absolutely crucial, in that in a country like, say, Malaysia or Korea, which are fast-growing economies, and which have a domestic market that's actually appealing to multinationals, and they also have a very well-educated, high-skilled labor force. States actually have some leverage, because firms want access there. They want access to that market, and they want access to the labor force. And the state, therefore, if it's willing, if it wants to do it, can set up demands to these foreign multinationals to make some of their technology available. This is what China welcomed foreign investment for 35 years, but it did so with very strict conditions as to what multinationals would do with their technology. The second is this. I don't think it's possible to solve the technology problem without solving the employment problem. The reason for that, and this is less of an issue in Korea, where you don't have as big an informal labor force. But in countries like Indonesia and India, this is huge. These smaller firms, they face what's called an investment financing problem. They can't buy big technology, they can't buy the latest technology because they're small. They can't get access to the credit and the loans that they need. But just as importantly, precisely because they can't get access to the best technology, the way they remain competitive is by pressing down on wages as much as they can. Now, it's easy to press down on wages when you have 500 applicants for the same job, when you have a huge reserve army of labor. And so the route to being, and they're usually these small firms are subcontractors for larger firms, so there's enormous pressure on them to provide intermediate goods at very low prices. The way they provide it at very low prices is by giving essentially starvation level wages to their workers. That's a lot easier to do than to buy expensive technology. One way out of that is to raise what's called the reservation wage. The reservation wage is the alternative that workers have to any given employment opportunity that they might have. So if they don't like this wage, they know that there's a floor available to them in other jobs, right? The most effective way to increase the reservation wage is through two things. Agricultural reform, so that you don't have a semi-starvation level agricultural rural force, which drives down national wages. The second is to increase urban employment. And the way you increase urban employment, like I said earlier, is through, I think, public investment. Now, suppose you have massive public investment. People are finding jobs. As they find jobs, the competition for employment goes down. That means the baseline wages go up, which means smaller firms now have to offer a higher wage just for their own ordinary workers. In order to be able to afford that higher wage, now they have to try to become more efficient, more technologically productive, and thereby try to acquire the best technology. This is even true for larger firms. I think one reason why in England you have had near zero growth in investment for 15 years is that there's been such a massive lag in employment. As long as unemployment remains at a high level, large and small firms find it easy to try to increase their competitiveness through what's called the low road, by reducing wage levels, bringing down their unit costs, rather than through increasing their productivity, their labor productivity through investment, which also reduces unit costs, but in a much more labor productive way. So I think these are the two answers. State involvement, state assistance in negotiating with multinationals, and then state-provided public investments to suck up some of the labor, which will raise the reservation wage and thereby increase the incentives for acquiring technology.
Thank you, Professor Chibber. Now, let me invite Rizvi Nahar Ilhamullah.
Sorry. Okay, thank you. My name is Rizvi Nahar Ilhamullah. I am Ariman Scholars 2026 for SOAS. My question is, when we talk about the industrializations, we will talk about the subsidizing, licensing, and protecting, which is what you present for us. But I think there is one more specific policy, or I think supports, which is international supports that you are not present for us, which is when we talk about South Korea and Taiwan. And if we look at the data from Irwan in 1986, South Korea and Taiwan alone is granted for $6 billion from the US aid for their industrializations. It is compared if you compare to the Africa, for the entire Africa, US aid only granted $6.9 billion and only $40 billion for Latin America. And how the South global countries can enter the market of USA or Europe if they don't have the international supports. And also in 1989, correct me if I'm wrong, but USA has the deficit of trade for South Korea for about 7.6 billion USA. I think that's it for me.
I think it's a mistake to think that the key to development is foreign loans or foreign assistance. It's also a trap. Loans can come into your country and they can be completely wasted. They can go into people's pockets. They can go into corrupt deals. And that's been the history of international loans. And in fact, if the loans are given to you at high interest rates, it becomes a debt trap. The key to development is to have a political economy and firms within that political economy that take their investable funds. Some of those investable funds will come from loans, some will come from domestic savings, but wherever they're coming from, to have incentives to reinvest them productively rather than to hoard them or to fritter them away in all kinds of what's called rent seeking. So if foreign loans were the key to development, I'll tell you, India got the most foreign loans of any developing country in the 50s and 60s. It would have outpaced Korea by orders of magnitude. So I do think that it helps. I do think that, especially in the 50s and 60s, when domestic saving rates were low, foreign loans played an important part. Today, I think it's a non-issue. And the reason is you just look at domestic saving rates across the global south. In the 30s and 40s, they were at 5–8%. Today, they're at 25 to 35%. So investable funds is not a constraint. The constraint is what you do with those investable funds. You need a domestic structural transformation away from mining and primary goods towards producing manufacturing goods and moving up the value chain. And you need local firms that either on their own are compelled to reinvest or are administratively compelled to reinvest. But I would not put loans as the constraint there.
So, Vivek, related to the loan or international capital, based on your research, India, South Korea, what is the key difference between international loan on that day and financial capital today? Especially when it comes to, let's say, disciplining the firms. At that day, many national governments, they are able to discipline the firms. But now, with the rise of international capital, in fact, they invited international capital to come, loosen the restrictions. What do you think of the future of this policy?
I think the main difference on the financial side, there are goods and there are bads. And in development studies, often we focus on the bad, which is because of the opening up of financial markets and the loosening of what's called capital controls. It's a lot easier for capitalists to resist state pressures through capital flight. That was harder to do in the classic Bretton Woods years because you had fixed exchange rates and you had capital controls. And so capital was kind of hemmed in inside the national borders. And so when states passed policies that business and firms were unhappy with, they had to figure out ways of resisting politically inside the country, whereas today they can just leave. Now that makes things hard, that's true. But it's also the case, as I said earlier, financial markets today are so deep and local savings rates are so high that states also have the ability to raise capital and to create capital funds at a level they couldn't even dream of in the 50s and 60s. So I don't want to minimize the problem of capital flight. It's a real problem. I don't know how much of a binding constraint it is when you have the financial depth that you have in today's world. Here, the second thing I would say is this. I think there's a difference in the kinds of challenges that smaller countries face that are slow growing with regard to imposing their will on either multinational firms or domestic firms, and larger, faster growing countries. The reason is larger, faster growing countries have a lot to offer to domestic and international capitalists, which makes capital flight less likely. The real dilemma is for the smaller countries, because if you're a country like Thailand, or if you're a country like Brunei, you're very, very hard-pressed to go up against large firms. And I think there it's going to take a change in the global order for other countries to coordinate with these countries to be able to negotiate with firms? To think like ASEAN, the regional alliances. But the larger countries have a lot that they can still, I think, accomplish. And my hope is that if larger countries are able to see a change in their domestic political constitutions and coalitions, it sets up the conditions to reach alliances and regional agreements with smaller countries in which businesses are forced to also negotiate with them in good faith. But that's more of a hope than anything else.
No, it seems to me that industrial policy not merely domestic policy, but it requires international cooperation among countries. But before we go to that point, I have two related questions to your last point from Professor Pierre van der Eng and Dr. Haikal from LPMUI. Let me invite Professor van der Eng and Dr. Haikal.
My name is Pierre van der Eng. I'm from the Australian National University.
I write it.
Thank you, Professor Chibber, for your discussion of industrial policy, taking the broad sweep of the decades since the Second World War. Most of your audience, I think, will be very interested in how Indonesia fits into your account. The thing is that you discussed why India is not like South Korea or Taiwan. But what about Indonesia? Is it the case of Indonesia similar to the case of India or different? After all, there is a similarity between Taiwan and South Korea in the past and Indonesia, and that is that all three had military dictatorships. What are your reflections on that?
I'm not very familiar with Indonesian facts and the facts of the Indonesian economy. All of you know far more than I do, and my hope was to provide a comparative and theoretical framework through which audience members and experts here could look at Indonesia. So as to the specifics of it, I can say very, very little, and I'll come to it. But there's a second part to your question, which is the military dictatorship question. This often comes up in discussions of developmental state. So let me address it first, which is, did you need a military dictatorship in order to have the kind of reciprocity and the performance benchmarks that the state was able to impose on these firms? I think the answer is categorically no. In fact, in my view, military dictatorships make it harder, not easier, to have a developmental state. There's a basic fallacy in the literature, which is that because discipline, the word discipline suggests power, that states which are dictatorships must have more power over the general population and therefore also businesses. But that's not in fact true. In fact, I think you might even say it's the opposite. Because you have to ask, what do dictatorships take away from the population? Well, it's democratic rights, obviously. And then you have to ask the question, do businesses depend on democratic channels in order to exercise their influence on the state? The answer is obviously no. Dictatorships often end up being cozy little partnerships between businesses and the state. What dictatorships do is remove the ability of the general population to have any power over the state. Dictatorships actually make it easier for business to have power over the state. So I would say dictatorships in Korea actually should be seen as something that the state had to overcome in order to exercise discipline, not something that enabled it. You cannot go around arresting all the businessmen or say, unless you do what I say, I'm going to arrest you. Why? If businesses feel that they're being asked to take on absolutely unrealistic and undesirable investments, and therefore they feel that unless we do this, we'll be arrested, the result is going to be a dramatic reduction in investment activity. They're just not going to do it. Businesses will not invest in lines where they feel that are unprofitable. And if you arrest them, all they're going to do is stop investing. They always have the option of saying no. On the other hand, with labor and the general population, they do have reason to worry about being arrested, about being thrown in jail. And that's why what we've seen is that in most dictators, so if Korea and Taiwan were helped because of the fact they're dictatorships, there should be a positive correlation between dictatorships and developmentalism, and there just isn't any. On the other hand, if you just look at the number of the cases that are successful cases of industrial policy anywhere, there are 4 that everybody agrees are successful cases. Korea, Taiwan, Japan, and France. Now, 2 of those countries are democracies, 2 of them are dictatorships. Now, if you line up all the dictatorships and you see how many of them were successful in industrial policy, you get 2 out of something like a dozen, and that's Korea and Taiwan. So that's a good thing. In fact, I would even make a stronger case. I think a democratic polity makes putting discipline on capital easier, not harder. And that's because states can rely on a kind of populist, ground-up strategy which mobilizes the population on the slogan, this is our money and they must be held accountable for how they use it. Now that's a pretty effective mechanism. This is our money, the population's money, and in a democratic country, we will hold them accountable. That's pretty powerful. The first question about Indonesia, because I know very little, let me just say that from what I know, Indonesia has chosen to concentrate on processing and export of primary goods, particularly its minerals. And that can be a good starting point because you're getting a lot of export revenue, and that export revenue can be redeployed towards investment of manufacturing, but that'll require some sort of helping hand of the state. My own prognosis would be that this is not a viable long-term strategy that Indonesia has embarked in. It needs to, it's in danger of being in kind of a Dutch disease problem of the resource curse, which is you just keep relying on easy access to these resources, but sooner or later you're going to have to go towards manufacturing, and that's going to mean a very skillful deployment of a disciplinary industrial policy, because your firms are very happy with sticking with the resource extraction and the mining. It's going to take some pushing to get them towards manufacturing.
Thank you, Vivek. So this is about Indonesia, but I think even though it's about Indonesia, but I think many countries also face the same problem. It's about discipline. Let me invite Pak Haikal.
Okay, thank you. Actually, I've already write my question. My name is Haikal. I'm from LPM, University of Indonesia. What I was wondering is that, okay, the state disciplining the firms, right? So who's actually disciplining the government? That's my question. This is correct or not, I don't know. Maybe in Indonesian case, policy consistency, policy credibility, and also the policy discipline is very weak. Is it because of Indonesians, have like incomplete state building or something, or I don't know. Maybe I would like to know your elaboration on that. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's one of the biggest dilemmas in development, which is development theory kind of presumes the existence of a developmental elite. And how to generate developmental elites is just, I don't think it's very well understood. I think it's kind of exogenous. So I would like to say that if you have a vibrant citizenry and a civil society that's demanding development and an end to corruption, that's what'll get it for you. But I think that's just almost trivially true. The question is, how would you raise such a movement, and how would they implement or impose their demands on their elites? And we just don't know. There was a reason you had what's called a developmental era at mid-century, and that's because at mid-century you had, for the first time, the coincidence of very large labor movements and decolonization, both things happening. And so elites felt in some way obliged to do something for a mobilized citizenry. Where you are today is a very different situation. You have a demobilized citizenry, very powerful states, and an international elite that's oligarchic in the extreme. And I don't know if there's a social scientific answer to the question of who disciplines the elite that I would find interesting in a, in a non-trivial way. I'm sorry, I just don't know if we have one.
So Vivek, some people say that when asking who discipline the elite or the state, some people say that number one is vulnerability, strategic vulnerability. That's according to donor and friends. That one of the reasons why South Korea was so successful, because number one is they are vulnerable in the sense they do not have much resource endowment. They face severe threat from North Korea, and they face threat from the labor. So threat from the labor is one of the reason why the elite could be disciplined. But now there are many questions regarding the labor. You also have indicated actually labor around the world in terms of the organization, now they are weaker from the past. So the question is, given the current situation, when you say that the recipe for successful industrial policy is either capital plus state, or labor plus state, or it can be labor against the state, right? So now, given the current situations, how is it possible that in the fact that now we have large informal sectors in many countries, with the rise of technology, with the AI, maybe there can be many replacements of the workers. So there are many questions from the audience regarding how is it possible actually for many countries in the global south to strengthen the labor movement in order to discipline the elite. That's number one. Number two, when you said about the mobility of capital across borders, and you talk about, okay, maybe there should be, people will think about there should be collaboration or coordination across countries. Now, when it comes to labor, is it possible to have coordination across labors across different countries to make sure that actually capital will give the benefit for the countries in which the capital working?
We haven't found the answers to the first question, which is how is it possible to bring labor together? The reason for, let me say, social science is backward looking. In other words, social scientists wait for things to happen and then they explain them. And then they act as if they always knew it. But they don't. And so all of our theories of labor organizing were created post hoc once we looked at how labor was organized in the classical era of the labor movement from the 1890s to the 1930s. And we created a theory about it. And the problem with that theory was it made it seem that this is the only way you can ever organize labor, was the way they did it back then. We're in a very different kind of capitalism today than we were back then. And you all know what's different about it. The reduction in firm size, the informality, the way in which capital itself is much more mobile, et cetera, et cetera. So because in our lifetimes, there is not a single part of the world, not as far as I know, not a single part of the world, north or south, where you have seen a revitalized labor movement. All we've seen is declines in labor movements everywhere. We have not yet come up with the recipe or the solution to the question, how do you organize labor? I can offer 2 or 3 non-trivial, I think, observations and prognoses. One thing I feel is that in this era, some of the differences between North and South with regard to the labor movement are disappearing. One difference always used to be the South had a very large informal sector that was hard to organize, whereas in the North you had large manufacturing, what's called the organized sector, which could give you an organized labor movement. What's happening now is that you have 2 things occurring at once in both parts of the world. Tremendous reductions in the size of employment units and an informalization of labor everywhere. Now, one of the results of that is, I feel I can say with confidence is, if there is a revitalization of labor, it will not take the form that it did in the past, which is large trade unions sitting together with confederations of employers and having sector-wide or even nationwide collective bargaining. I don't think that's ever going to happen again, because that requires 60, 70, 80% union density. I don't know if we'll ever reach that kind of union density in capitalism again. Which means that the model for revitalizing labor and its institutions might have to be, and probably will have to be, quite different than it was in the past. I think what you'll find in the future is, rather than having nationwide collective bargaining or even sector-wide collective bargaining, what you might have to have is less union density, where you organize in key, not just key sectors, but key firms inside a sector, reach agreements with employers in those parts of the sector or the sector as a whole, and then have extension laws which then implements and mandates the agreements in the collective bargaining to the non-organized, non-unionized workers. Kind of like the French model in the post-war era. Now, what does that mean for organizing? It means you don't have to organize 60, 70% of the working class. You have to find those sections of the economy that are high value added, where workers have a lot of leverage, where they have work conditions that makes them amenable to organizing them. If you organize them, it has a big impact because they're in the sinews, the capillaries of the economy. Now that can be done in India, in Indonesia, and in the United States. And then you use that leverage for what's called the social wage. Instead of having higher wages coming through collective bargaining, I think you'll have higher wages coming through the decommodification of goods and services, so that the actual wage that they get at work reduces in its importance, and a lot of their access to the necessities of life are given as citizenship rights, social rights. That means you might have a different model in the future in which you rely on less union density but more union impact. That gives a window to even countries like Indonesia, where you will never get 60, 70% union density in Indonesia. I don't think you'll ever get it, but you might get 15 to 20%, and that might be enough.
Thank you, Vivek. So I hope you wouldn't mind to have one more last question.
I'm here all day.
Let me invite Colin Zhang from Sun Yat-sen University.
Thank you very much for your profound thinking, my professor. So my question is more about what you mentioned about the intergenerational, because you mentioned because there will be some industrial policy changes when domestic firms and political elites develop a new generation. So for me, because I also studied about Southeast Asia, so I would like to know more views from you about if you treat the Southeast Asia as the whole market. How do you treat about its special relations, like we have like patron and client relations, and what's quite the difference about the Southeast Asia, especially for this kind of intergenerational views? Thank you so much.
I have no idea. I wouldn't even know how to answer that question. I'm afraid I'm going to have to disappoint you.
Just want to mention about if you have this kind of political leaders or like economic business elites, well, it will make any sense for next generation because it's a young countries, just like mentioned about. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. I have no idea what it means intergenerationally.
Thank you so much.
Okay, Vivek, maybe if you wouldn't mind, one last question from, I think this is a very good one, from Dauda Atule.
Thank you. My name is Dauda Atule. I'm a political science in Universitas Islam Indonesia here. I think I enjoyed your conversation, and on the two major themes that you actually emphasize on, of which I'm very happy because it's something I've been working on for some time, on issues of the politics of IP and the centrality of private firms, which bond back to discipline. So anchoring my question on the issues of discipline, who disciplines state, or and other things. what happened is that when I tried to engage the debate of the return of IP, what I realized is that we continue to situate the debate around the grand policy strategy states adopt. Take, for instance, Ghana adopt a private-led industrial policy strategy. Policy remained unchanged for decades, but I was concerned about why doesn't it transform into development. I found something interesting, is that when we look at the grand policy, we begin to be a bit reductive in our conclusion that it's issues of capacity or it's policy design problem. However, we see that there is issues of the political dynamics within, which is tied to electoral incentives, of which when the grand policy exists, government that comes in, that goes out. What you tend to do is that you come with your own strategy of how you want to implement such policy, that not just for the purpose of development, but you want to have a design that tied to your political identity for political vote. So what do you also think that we also look at, going to look at the granular level of what actually even happens that makes a grand policy strategy adopted by a state succeed or fail, rather than just looking at how the policy, the grand policy trajectory has transformed over time. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's not so much a question as it is a statement. And it seems correct to me that these grand policies depend on what's happening with the incentive structure and at the ground level with political forces. I mean, that's what I've tried to argue. So I suspect you were just affirming what I was saying rather than asking a question.
Yeah, so thank you very much. And
sure.
I wish I could engage you later on my paper that I've been struggling on review ethics. Thank you.
Sure.
I was wrong. I thought it's question. So anyway, I think that's a good point to end the session. So thank you very much for providing the lecture, overseeing the policy. And with this, let me end the session. Once again, thank you very much, Vivek.
Thank you very much, Professor Chibber and Dr. Arif, for the extensive insight delivered during the keynote speech. Next, ladies, gentlemen, and honorable guests, we now enter the first plenary session, Inequality in Indonesia 1. So we humbly invite the chair and speakers of the session, starting with the moderator, Dr. Gede Dwitia from UIII. Dr. Gede, are you here with us? Okay. Next, we invite Pierre van der Eng, Research School of Management, Australian National University. Next, we have Umbu Reku Raya from Sumba Cendekia Bestari, Indonesia. Last but not least, Dr. Zulfan Tajuddin, Western Sydney University. Please come to the stage. Ladies and gentlemen, round of applause to our next speakers of the session. And to Dr. Gede, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. This is our first plenary session with the theme of inequality in Indonesia. We have three esteemed speakers. The first is, like our MC has mentioned, Professor Pierre van der Eng from Australian National University. And then we have also Dr. Umbu Rekuraya. Dr. Umbu, welcome, from Sumba Cendekia Bestari. And then last but not least, we have Dr. Zulfan Tajuddin from Western Sydney. Welcome to UIII. The plenary session will be delivered by inviting each one of our esteemed speakers to deliver their presentation and then followed up by Q&A. I think we can start by inviting the first speaker, Prof. Pierre van der Eng. The IT team, is it ready already? The PowerPoint? Yes. May I ask you to give a warm applause for our first speaker, Professor Pierre van der Eng.
Well, the technical team is loading up my presentation. Let's hope it will appear soon, then you don't have to look at me. Let me start by thanking the organizers of this conference, particularly Sirojudin, for inviting me to present at this conference. And I hope that my presentation will be in line with the expectations of the organizer, because it builds on an idea. It builds on an idea that I had about saying more about inequality in Indonesia than what has been done so far by many, including many esteemed colleagues of mine. So I'm going to talk about evidence that we have about changes in wealth inequality in Indonesia, roughly during the last 35 years. And the reason to talk about this topic is that quite a few years ago now, I have, together with Andrew Lee, a colleague of mine at the Australian National University, published a paper on top incomes in Indonesia over a long time period. Andrew was very interested in doing this topic because Andrew is now a member of parliament in Australia, and he actually grew up in Indonesia, in Banda Aceh, and he wanted to go back to his roots, doing a research project on this topic. And we did this because Thomas Piketty's World Inequality Lab invited us to say more about what is known about top incomes in Indonesia. But it wasn't that easy to do because one of the problems that we have with the data that are available on Indonesia is the fact that much depends on the quality of the household income data that, that come from the Susunas annual survey. And we knew very well that there are some problems with that because Susunas is basically, in terms of the estimates of income and household expenditure that it provides, suffering from underestimation. So this paper is a follow-up of that paper. And basically the question is, what other data than Susunas do we have in order to analyze trends in inequality in Indonesia? So what I'll try to do in my presentation is, first of all, come back to this point that I've just made, and meaning that there is a problem with the household survey data in terms of expenditure, income, and wealth information that they contain. Secondly, I'll briefly mention some other sources of alternative sources of wealth data that are available also for Indonesia, before going to the discussing the sources that I have used in this paper to say more about changes in wealth inequality in Indonesia. And basically they are the regular listings of Indonesia's wealthiest from Forbes, Forbes Asia, and also Globe Asia magazine. There are some shortcomings to those data, and I'll try to explain them briefly. But nevertheless, the data do show us something, and I'll show you what I found. Nevertheless, we have those data for Indonesia. The question still is a level of wealth inequality in Indonesia high or is it low? I have two answers to that. One, we can compare the recent data with the 1930s, have to go back in time a bit. And secondly, we can compare those data for Indonesia with similar data for other countries in the world to see how Indonesia stands out or not. And the conclusion of my paper will be we have more work to do than I have been able to do in this paper so far. So let me go back to the household survey data, which are regularly used in many publications in order to provide an analysis of changes in the level of, the degree of inequality across Indonesia. And basically there are two sources that are regularly used. The Susunas data, of course, produced annually in 2 rounds by the Badan Pusat Statistics here in Jakarta. Their household survey data, they cover all provinces. BPS claims that the data are representative. We're not talking about panel data here. In other words, the survey is population changes with each round of the survey. And secondly, there are the IFLS data, smaller sample, a deeper survey, by the range of questions are being asked, but only in 13 provinces. The advantage of this survey is that they ask the same questions to the same households regularly, so they are panel data, but they only do that for selected years. And the last one was in 2014. There are some problems with these survey data for inequality research. I've mentioned already when grossing up the average incomes or average expenditure or average wealth of households, if not individuals, to national level, it turns out that they cover around about 40 to 60% of household expenditure or of household income compared to what the annual national accounts generate. In other words, they underestimate income and expenditure and possibly also wealth. But we don't know that because BPS does not produce wealth data. And the reasons why that is are not that difficult to gauge, have been acknowledged by BPS as well. For one thing, it asks households how much they spend during the last year on particular items. And that, of course, excludes items that households don't spend money on every year, like dwellings, like cars, possibly motorbikes, etc. But the main problem with these data is that they underrepresent high income earners. Just a moment. So high income earners are underrepresented in the sample that is used for both surveys. And that's not a secret. The World Bank, for example, has repeated this point in several publications already. And for that matter, since 2006, the World Bank has been promising to augment Susuna's expenditure data for underestimation in order to get a more complete impression of changes in income and expenditure in inequality in Indonesia. But nothing has been published so far. So yes, Susuna's and IFLS data, they're very good. We can use them in order to analyze trends in poverty, the lower income scales, even trends in low and mid-income households, but it's not really useful for analyzing the whole spectrum of income and wealth in Indonesia. There are alternative data, I've mentioned that, in order to assess changes in wealth. They are regularly referred to in the media, also in Indonesia. And they come from global wealth management or consulting companies, which have been producing them since the 1990s. Companies like Capgemini, Knight Frank, etc. And the main purpose of those publications is to identify the size of the high net wealth high net wealth individuals population, in order to identify the size of national markets of these rich people and the markets for the wealth management services or the top real estate services that such companies can provide. It's not really useful for the analysis of inequality trends. Therefore, these data are regularly referred to in the media, but you have to be very cautious with them. They don't serve the purpose of academic analysis. Nevertheless, they do provide us with information about the distribution of net wealth across many countries, also in Indonesia, and I've included 3 years for which, in this case, Credit Suisse, UBS show the changes in the number of wealthy people in Indonesia. And you can see at the end that the Gini ratio of wealth inequality is quite high. But all these sources are quite obscure about exact methodologies that they use. And where they declare their methodologies, it turns out that generally they extrapolate the wealth data that they obtain from IFAR, the survey that has been conducted last in 2014. And the question there is, how are these data extrapolated to a national scale? How are they extrapolated from 2014 to 2025? Can we trust what they say, for example, about 2025? Or, in the case of the table on the screen, to 2022. So these data, yes, they suggest significant high wealth inequality in Indonesia, but is that real? Is that true? Or is it an extrapolation artifact? Yet another source that can be used are listings, regular listings of Indonesia's wealthiest. Several magazines have published them, also in the past, particularly Forbes magazine, of course, which publishes rankings of billionaires since 1987. Forbes Asia, which publishes 40 to 50 wealthiest people in Indonesia since 2006. And an Indonesian magazine, Globe Asia, has published 150 wealthiest for a few years, but it's no longer doing that. The methodologies which they used, they differ. They're largely based on the market capitalization of the companies which rich people in Indonesia tend to control. But the question remains whether all controlled companies are included, because for public companies it's easy to include them in these estimates, but privately owned companies, how do we estimate the value of the private companies? These data also suggest that, or these publications suggest that they include the estimates of personal assets, such as real estate, cars, jewelry, etc., but how are they valued? It's not immediately obvious how that has been done. Now, in the case of Indonesia, these listings only started in the early 1990s. There are some alternative listings for the 1980s, of rupiah billionaires rather than US dollar billionaires. But it was a bit difficult, let's say sensitive, in the 1980s to produce these lists. Instead of producing lists of rupiah billionaires, there was only one that is available for 1984. Instead of publishing such a listing of rupiah billionaires, different magazines produced listings of conglomerates, the assets of companies in conglomerate enterprises as proxies of personal wealth. And they did that during the 1990s. That was a bit of a problem for Forbes magazine because it had difficulties estimating the wealth of the Suharto family in its its annual listing of billionaires around the world, including in Indonesia. So those sources are available, and they're hardly used for the purpose of checking, tracing wealth inequality in Indonesia over time. Yeah, it looks like they're useful, but we have to keep in mind that even with the top 150 wealthiest people in Indonesia, we're talking about a fraction of Indonesia's wealth owners. Well, with several zeros, I put the number there. It's very, very tiny. And with the top 50, of course, it's even tinier. So correcting Susanas and IFAR data on the basis of these data, yeah, it doesn't really work because we really need a few thousands of high income earners, wealth owners, in order to be able to make such a correction. Nevertheless, we can work with these data, and that's what I've done in this paper. For example, in order to see how the number of billionaires changed over time in Indonesia. And depending on the source, the answers are different. Forbes magazine says that they increased in number from 3 in 1990 to 35 in 2025, and Forbes Asia says they increased in number from 7 to 48 in 2025. And if you go down the listings of the names of the people involved, listed in those listings, you'll come across names that are very familiar with to anyone who is familiar with Indonesia's business. The Salim Group, the Wijayas, the Hartonos, of course, etc. Over time, there has been some changes, especially generation changes, as the older, let's say, business heads of business families passed away and handed over to their younger progeny. But the big problem is here that we're talking about numbers. We're not talking about an aggregation of wealth. And when expressing the totals of wealth, we also have to take account of the fact that over time, wealth tends to increase due to inflation, also in US dollar terms. So we have to normalize total wealth of these richest in Indonesia. And I've normalized it by expressing it as a ratio of GDP. Yeah? So the ratio normalizes wealth relative to GDP, and GDP here is basically a proxy for overall change in business opportunities for everyone in the Indonesian economy. So the ratio is basically a proxy which indicates change in the advantages of the wealthy in business relative to everyone in business. And you can see that the trends, they vary by source, but there are two significant episodes of increases, 1992 to 1996 and 2010 to 2025. And the other thing that stands out in this graph is that the trend is by and large set by the wealth controlled by billionaires, possibly the top 50 wealthiest in Indonesia, not so much by the other 100 millionaires that are also indicated in this graph. Okay, we see the ratio increase, 0.15 to 0.22 in 2025. Is that high or is that low? Well, one possibility is comparing that to the 1930s, because Indonesia had a wealth tax introduced in 1932 and withdrawn after the tax reforms of 1983. And I have the data for the 1930s, and they show, surprisingly, that the ratio of the richest, 150, 50 or 40, relative to GDP, is a lot lower in the 1930s. I don't have a definite answer to why this is, but we can guess. One possible guess is that it relates to differences in the degree to which tax rules are enforced, were enforced in the 1930s compared to more recent periods. Another possible hypothetical explanation would be, well, in the 1930s, Indonesia was still at an early stage of economic development, and if you know your introductory economics, you know that over time, according to the Kuznets curve, inequality increases in early stages before it peaks and then it decreases. So maybe in the 1930s we're talking about an early stage of the Kuznets curve. In the 2020s, maybe we're talking about a peak in the Kuznets curve, and in the near future, inequality, in this case of wealth, will decrease. Maybe. Let's see. Another way of comparing these ratios that I have shown you is by comparing it with, for Indonesia, with similar data for other countries in the world. I have put them in a graph for 2019. What you see, the blue dots, they're all indicating the ratio of net wealth to GDP of resident billionaires by countries. Yeah, and the blue dotted line indicates what in 2019 is the sort of normal situation, right? And where's Indonesia? Well, Indonesia 1990 to 1996, 2006 to 2025, the wealth of billionaires relative to GDP, it increased significantly, as you can see in the first orange line going up, and that especially happened between 1992 and 1996. And then the second orange lines jumping up. That is especially between 2020 and 2025. Aha. And then the question is, and I don't have the answer to that yet, what do those two periods have in common? Well, the 1990s was a period of cronyism, nepotism of President Suharto and his friends and family members. And also a period when a lot of new wealth was created in resources industries, mining, palm oil, forestry, for example. And the 2010-2025 period, yes, perhaps similar, because Indonesia experienced a China-led minerals boom. A lot of new wealth being created in resources sector, mining, palm oil, forestry, for example. So maybe that's a similarity. Maybe that's where we have to find and look into the reasons for this significant increase in what looks like wealth inequality in Indonesia. Zooming in, and this is a zoom in of the graph that I've just shown you, we can compare the degree, the ratios for emerging economies. And that shows that the wealth of Indonesia's billionaires relative to GDP, 2022-2025, all of a sudden has become comparable to what it was in India, China, and Thailand in 2019. And what is special about those three countries in 2019, or around 2019, is that those three countries had very high income Gini coefficients. And hopefully you're familiar with the term Gini coefficient. It indicates the degree of inequality of income. India, quite high, 2017, China, 2023, Thailand, 2021. And that means that whatever estimates exist for Indonesia in terms of Gini coefficients, which are published by BPS on a monthly basis and which are a lot lower, well, maybe those Gini coefficients published by BPS are too low. I think my time is almost up, so let me finish here. Basically, what I've found is that that Susanas and IFLS underestimate measures of income and expenditure, possibly wealth inequality in Indonesia, and I found a very rapid increase in the ratio of the wealth of Indonesia's billionaires and the wealth of Indonesia's richest relative to GDP, especially since 2010, to quite high levels, which suggests that perhaps inequality in terms of incomes in Indonesia these days is comparable to India, China, and Thailand around about 2019. But these are my initial findings. I think I have more work to do, and I put 3 points there to indicate what other work I intend to do. Let me leave it at this.
Thank you, Prof. Pierre. Now we have our second speaker, Dr. Zulfan Tajuddin from Western Sydney University. The IT team, can you have Prof. Zulfan PowerPoint? Yes. Mas Zulfan, time is yours.
Okay, good late morning, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank UI3 for inviting me for this conference. So, actually, I am a substitute. I was scheduled for the last plenary, and then just 2 days ago, I was asked to move to the first plenary. So, I'm a bit nervous, just to begin with. So this is not really about inequality in Indonesia, but more of a bit more comparative look at Southeast Asia. And then I would like to compare Indonesia and the Philippines. And I just want to put a bit of probably eye-catching title about the concern over the Philippinizations of Indonesia. And the heart of the concern is about inequality and the changing contours of inequality in Indonesia. So hopefully that will advocate for the relevance of my talk. Indonesia and the Philippines, two largest countries in Southeast Asia, a lot of similarities. 300 years under colonialism, one by Dutch, the other one by Spain. But the legacy of Spain in Philippines will be a lot deeper than the legacy of Dutch in Indonesia, for better or worse. We'll see later. And then the largest in terms of populations, archipelagic, diverse, but the only difference is one dominated by Muslims, the other one dominated by the Catholic. But my experience walking in Manila or in the provincial parts of Philippines, I really feel the same. The people, the atmosphere, the culture, really the same. But this is the interesting part. How to move? Okay, not just one. Okay, let's go back to the situations in the 50s and 60s. Philippines was very much in the very good shape. The second richest country in Asia after Japan. The one that will be much more ready to take off, to benefit from the waves of new countries emerging from colonialism. So if you compare, don't compare Philippines with Indonesia. Indonesia was the basket case, infested by malaria and no hope, according to observers around that time. Don't compare Philippines with Indonesia. Compare Philippines with South Korea. Even Philippines was in much better shape than South Korea to thrive. So that was the situations in 1950s, 1960s. So very contrast with Indonesia. But what happened later? Reversal of fortune. The divergence between Indonesia and the Philippines. Something goes wrong. Yeah. This is the long-term picture of the reversal of fortune, the divergence. And really, this is about the turning point was in the late 80s. You can see there, initially, Philippines had much higher per capita GDP than Indonesia. And then Indonesia overtook Philippines. And then you see later, it seems like the diversion will continue. So this is the best comparable data that we can have at the moment, produced by the same source, by the same estimates. And then who is responsible for Indonesia overtaking the Philippines? We have to thank Suharto. And then Philippines will have to blame Ferdinand Marcos. So on the other hand, on the side of the Philippines, Philippines got the title of the sick man of Asia, and Indonesia joined the elite club of high-performing Asian economies, joining the Asian miracle. But what happened later? After the divergence, it seems like we are going to see a kind of convergence. And the convergence is not about the per capita GDP, but the convergence is about inequality and the changing nature of inequality in Indonesia. So that's basically the conclusions of what I have to say. Now, let's see the divergence. Now, this is just to recap the divergence between Indonesia and the Philippines. The first one is the different nature of the elite class. So it is good that the legacy of Dutch colonialism in Indonesia, the 300 years of colonialism, actually did not produce significant elite class. Unlike the way colonialism put South Asian countries as a new country after the Second World War. You will find a very significant elite class in South Asia, in India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, in Malaysia, in Philippines, but not in Indonesia. And then the second one is, as the implications of the initial elite class, you will see the situation in the Philippines characterized as the weak state, strong families. And then the implications, the state was captured by the powerful families, by the powerful elites. But in Indonesia, because of the elite was not there, everyone were powerless and then equally poor. And then as the outcome of different nature of Spain colonialism and Dutch colonialism in the two countries, and the nature of the state in Indonesia is a bit stronger and more unified. And then the next one. This is the thing that follows from the previous two dot points. During Soeharto in Indonesia, this is what is called by Jeffrey Winters as the time oligarch. Yes, there is oligarch, but oligarchs is disciplined by the Sultan. But this is different. In the Philippines, the Sultan could not discipline the oligarch. You have the situations where the state was captured and then subordinated by the powerful rent-seeking oligarchic family. So this is the key point that holds the prospective potential Philippines post-independence to thrive as post-colonial states for the next 80 years. And then this is the another difference. If we compare the situations of Suharto's Indonesia and Marcos' Philippines, in Indonesia, we like it or not, the elite class have stake in the country. Indonesian elites not so much foreign-oriented. They love the country. But in the Philippines, they are very much foreign-oriented, especially the US, as the legacy of the US colonialism. So you will find the data how massive was the capital flight from Philippines for a long period of time. In Indonesia, capital run from the country, but for the majority of the stolen money still stay within the country. The money stay within the country, we still do good for the country. Yeah? You name it money laundering, you name it whatever it is, but the money stays. And then there is a joke about this one. You steal the money, you keep the money inside the country, not putting somewhere else outside the country, and then that has been called as patriotic corruptions rather than unpatriotic corruptions. So that's another one that explains the difference between Philippines and Indonesia. Now, this is the convergence. The convergence after a few decades, and these pictures actually portray the convergence. I still remember, I was in Manila 2 years ago in a conference, and then the winner of the elections, the last elections in Indonesia, the presidential elections, had been confirmed. And then a couple of Philippines political scientist colleague joke with me. They say that, why are you following us? We have been going into wrong directions for some time. Now you are following us. So this is someone following someone, and someone that is being followed are not that happy why they are being followed. So that's represent where we are heading. I'm not saying that Indonesia has become Philippines. No, one country will not be like another country. That will not be the case. But when we are thinking of the directions, this is where the concern can be raised. I think that's the point. Not to say that, it will be too speculative that to say that Indonesia has become the Philippines. So this is the parallel. And those pictures also have parallel with the previous picture, Suharto and Marcos. Now you see the son of Marcos and the son-in-law of Suharto. So how beautiful is the history, right? Now, this is the data to show the convergence. This is not about per capita GDP, but more of the, not that long compared to Pierre's presentation earlier. This is a very short period of time, but I believe that this diagram shows the convergence. We have two Gini index for Indonesia. One for expenditure from Susanas. That is the blue lines. And then the black lines, that is the Gini from the best proxy for income in Indonesia, which is from Sakernas, wage or earnings of the workers. As you can predict, inequality level for income will be higher than consumptions. Because of in the consumptions, you will have the smoothing effects of savings. You have less income, you draw your saving. You have more income, you put more saving. So that's why consumption inequality will always be lower than income inequality. What about in the Philippines? They have Gini index for income, not consumptions. As you can see, the source for Gini index for income in the Philippines is called FIES, Family Income and Expenditure Survey. So this is more, from the name, this is more rigorous survey. The survey is conducted every 3 years, not twice a year like Susan has. Every 3 years, and then the survey focusing on family income and expenditure. The source of the blue lines, the Gini expenditure, the name of the survey is National Socio-Economic Survey. The survey that asks everything: movement, expenditure, jobs. So you can imagine that more broad survey will produce a weaker result than more specific survey. So from the name, I suspect that the quality of Gini index for Philippines will be a lot better than the quality of Gini index for Gini expenditure based on Susanas. That's my suspect, based on just reading the name of the survey. I haven't done any proper comparative study with the Sakernas and Family and Expenditure survey in the Philippines. But if you compare income to income, the red dots and the black lines, you will find some relevance. So we have to revisit them. We used to understand that Philippines used to have higher inequality than Indonesia. But looking at the data, it is not the case. The levels are quite comparable. And you look at what happened in the area that I put the circle. They are converging, not diverging. So this is the initial evidence for the convergence. Now, let's look at this one. This is based on the World Inequality Database developed by Thomas Piketty. And then I just take 2 countries, Indonesia and the Philippines. The share of wealth of the top 1%, the richest 1%. And you look at, of course, the level of wealth concentration in the Philippines way higher than Indonesia, traditionally higher than Indonesia. But Indonesia has been catching up, especially for the past few years after COVID. So this is the best comparable data. Of course, there are weaknesses in this data. There are weaknesses in the previous data on Gini index. But at least they are pointing to the same directions. Another data, utilizing the concept of material power index introduced by Jeffrey Winters. And then you look at what happened in Indonesia. The way the 50 richest billionaires, if they are compared with the average citizen in Indonesia, the situation has been even worse in Indonesia compared to the Philippines. Of course, this is explained by the growth and the stagnations of the economy in the Philippines before. But you can see here, so if we combine this one and the previous one, that will point to the convergence in the nature of how inequality in Indonesia has changed. And then this is the conclusion for Indonesia. On the one hand, we have the trend of decreasing Gini index. At least after the peak of Gini index in Indonesia in 2011-2012. And we know that the first medium-term development plan put forward by the first term of Joko Widodo, that was the first development plan that specifically put inequality reductions as a macro development target. The first in the history of Indonesia. And then inequality has been slowly declined, although the target has never been achieved, but at least the level of Gini index has declined steadily, slowly. Yeah? Now, this is the contrast. On the one hand, we have declining Gini. On the other, we have increased wealth concentrations. How do we reconcile? This is what is meant by the changing nature of inequality in Indonesia. So let me conclude. So the concern over the Filipinizations of Indonesia basically consists of two things. One is the rise of, or the proliferations of powerful political families acquiring more political power, and political power eventually will improve their wealth. And then that has been spreading in Indonesia at national level and also at the local levels. So decentralization, democratizations actually have created the rise of more and more powerful families with accumulated wealth. Of course, the level has no way compared to the Philippines, but the trend is there. And the risk of this kind of trend is they are going to have more power, more ability, more agency to bend the state. And I believe that this has been very much the concern of the middle class in Indonesia that has been labeled as the Londo Ireng. That has been the concern by them. I think that's the end of the conclusions of my talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Tajudin. Please hold your questions before the Q&A. We have our last but not least presenter, Dr. Umburaya, who will talk about intra-group inequality in Indonesia. Dr. Raya, the time is yours.
Thank you, Pierre, and thank you, Zulfan, for setting the stage, talking about the wealthiest. I think it is an interesting story and on how people have invested a lot of fund to measure wealth inequalities, right? And I expect that there is a trend both in among the economists and also among the political scientists of looking at wealth at the wealthiest indirectly as a bad thing. Yeah? Sometimes I think especially in the political arena during the presidential election, yeah, where you look at the if you look at the median voter theorem, that you expect the poorest, yeah, to build strong ally with the middle class to topple the elites, yeah, for the sake of income and wealth distribution. Yeah. That is why in most, what to say, if we, for lack of a better term, in progressive societies or progressive states, there is a tendency of increasing the tax rate as wealth increases, right? I'll be talking more into the micro economic sense of these wealth inequalities, and more into the, if we can say, the bottom of the hierarchy, the lowest income. And I'll be looking more from, not from state or region perspective, but look at the people as a people group, yeah? Where according to the, somehow, I think there's consensus that welfare and inequalities are co-determined by differences in geography, differences in political and economic institutions, differences in culture, and sometimes I think analysts neglect this, the other aspect on agency and choices. Yeah. I think in Indonesia, not every people's group actually put income or wealth as the crown indicator of their welfare. Yeah. As you will see from the discussion later, people place other indicator, yeah, at the same level of this, for the lack of a better term, the worldly indicator, ya. Ini hal duniawi, tapi even among the indigenous, there is an emphasis on the welfare of the soul, yeah. And in that, and that what is make a bit difficult sometimes to, you know, for the policy of the state and even the, and also for the NGO workers to boost welfare among the indigenous as measured by the BPS and the World Bank, because the indigenous people may have different ideas about what is good for their life, what they believe. Yeah. Can I? Okay. Why Eastern Indonesia? I think this one is one of Pak Siro's question last time. We think that Eastern Indonesia actually offer as a unique setting, yeah, to examine the interaction between geography, institution, culture, and agency in shaping individual and group welfare. Yeah. About 70% of people groups in Indonesia actually reside from Sulawesi and East Indonesia to the east. Yeah. More to the east, from Alor in NTT all the way to Maluku and Papua. Yeah. There are two distinct groups, the Austronesian speaking groups and the Papuan speaking groups. Yeah, the Austronesian speaking groups tend to reside in the coastal areas, while the Papuan speaking group tend to reside in the highland. Yeah. And more specifically, I will be discussing the three people group, the Sumbanis in East Nusa Tenggara, the Toraya people, or sometimes for misspelled by the Indonesian as Toraja, the Highlanders of Sulawesi, and the Highlanders of Papua. So this is a descriptive study. Economic inequality in Eastern Indonesia, as if we use the lens of the most of the economists and the especially behavioral economics, we say that geography, institution, culture, and agency or choices interplay. So in such regions such as in Sumba and Toraya and highlands of Papua, entrenched feudal hierarchy, indigenous slavery, ritual prestige economics, and geographic isolation have combined to reinforce deep intra-group disparities. So within those groups who are actually who mainly agriculturists, there is a commonness that the feudal hierarchy based on what people believe as the purity of blood, that also go hand in hand with the land ownership. Actually, it's the one that people use to control resources, including public resources. And these three groups, despite their potential, the Indonesian government has boosted tourism investment in these three groups, marketing them as the next Bali. Yeah. However, what we see in the statistic is that the poverty rates of these three groups tend to be higher, so they tend to be poorer compared to the other people groups in the same island. Yeah, if you think of an island economy approach. Yeah. So this structure and cultural constraints, both the structure and also the agency of the people themselves, because they don't want to change because of certain belief. When you compare them to the way the other indigenous group, especially from the coastal areas, and the migrant from West Indonesia, and also the Chinese and the Arab group, then it causes inter-group inequality of income. Because if you think of this as a Moglo or Cobb-Douglas progression function, where you think that people actually maximize production, maximize income, maximize life satisfaction as we understood in modern sense, by boosting saving and investment in order to reproduce a better income, better production productivity in the next term. What happens is among the three indigenous people is that they are entrapped in the belief that they should do a proper funerary rituals of to send off this the deceased corpse of the nobility families to heaven, by running an extravagant, conspicuous festival. So funeral is not a sad event in this place. It is actually a feast that they believe will increase the probability of the deceased to reach heaven. If you look back at the political idea or the idea of the political activists and NGO activists that sometimes frame inequality of income and then the wealthy as being sinful, because inequality itself in itself means disparity, and the disparity is perceived as something that is not noble, in a way. We look at the determinant of the persistent inequality as if there is discriminatory institution, and extractive practices that limit, limit the opportunity of the poor or the lower class to access resources. Yeah. And in Toraja, it's not very visible, but in Sumba, where indigenous slavery still persists, you probably, I don't know if you see the article from one of the France news 2 weeks ago on practicing indigenous slavery in Sumba. And in Highland Papua, one of the indications is that in general election, in certain communities, only the leader that vote to represent the whole community, what we call as the Noken system. Noken is the traditional bag of Papua. And then if you look at the climate change risk, the impact will fall hardest on the poor because they mostly are in subsistence agriculture. And then this will exacerbate the both income and intergroup inequalities. The data is from our observation, sorry. Should I? Okay. The data is mix of our own observation, analysis from the census and survey data since 1930 to 2015, and meta-analysis of or desk review from previous literatures. So now I go to the first case, the Tauhumba or the Sumba people. Poverty and stunting. This is one of the most poorest district and island in the last 20 years, according to the BPS. It's very close to Bali, actually, so it's one hour flight from Bali. But some analysis has said that, but it seems that the island is 200 years away in terms of development from Bali. So it's poverty and stunting. Occupation of the indigenous is mostly low productive agriculture. Illness, this is one of the 2 islands in Indonesia where malaria is still a big thing. The Ministry of Tourism has named the island as the second Bali, in terms of tourism. However, what we observe is none of the indigenous people actually invest in tourism sector, due to lack of saving. And slavery. So intra-group inequality, one of the main hurdle that make intra-group inequality persist is that even during this democratization era when one person vote, each person's vote is counted equal, but in Sumba, slavery is not abolished because I think the government and also the church, the Protestant church, see it as part of the people's culture. So you can be enslaved and you can vote. So the nobles monopolize this land, ritual capital. The slavery is, even the wording, the slavery is consists of injustice already. So in this sense, there is some aspect of injustice. In terms of consumption, there is a tendency previously by the noble class to run an extravagant funeral, but with the increasing income of the commoner class, they also, I think there's a tendency like in India of Sanskritization practices where the lower caste will mimic the higher caste on practices in order to gain prestige. Yeah? And because of this very high cost practices, what happens is that the ability of saving or even the willingness of saving is very low. Yeah. Saving low, then you don't expect the indigenous will have good investment. I will go to, okay, this one, the Toraja. Yeah. The poverty rate of the Torajanis is actually 2 times their indigenous rivals, yeah, the Bugis. But the Torajanis keep practicing this, what they call a strambusolo, yeah, the send off of the deceased to heaven, according to the Alok Todolo religion, the indigenous religion. Although the people of Toraja, if asked by the BPS during the census, they will mention that they're Christian. Yeah. But actually, in daily life, the practices is more of indigenous religion. That is difficult to modify, to soften, to democratize. Yeah. To the point that this buffalo and pigs needed for the rituals actually supplied by the Bugis people, yeah, who in the past are not interested in doing commerce in pigs. Yeah. Okay, a bit more. I think they. Okay, I will just give it 2 more minutes. Yes. Yeah.
5 minutes, Dr. Rumbu.
Okay. Okay. So, what is in common? Yeah. Among the people who has been labeled as the poorest of the poor in Indonesia, those who lag behind despite their natural endowment potential. Yeah. First is there is a lack of willingness to change. Yeah. So if we analyze the intra situation of the group themselves, they don't want to change. Yeah. In Sumba, even if they convert to Christianity or Islam, they will still prefer to run the expensive rituals. Yeah. Because of the belief that they want to be safe in this world, but more than that, they want to be safe more in heaven. Yeah. And then you compare to the other indigenous people who don't share the same belief, and also the Tionghoa and Arab migrants, whose economic system is more into accumulating resources, yeah, accumulating money, building businesses. Yeah. Then intergenerationally, what happens is that the gap in welfare increases. Yeah. Not necessarily because the other indigenous people or the migrant actually steal the resources of the indigenous people, but because the indigenous people themselves prefer to overspend what they get. Yeah. One of the things that we also see is this lack of understanding from the government side, where the government actually incentivize these practices in the name of boosting tourism industry and not costing properly on its long-term impact on the indigenous people's life. Yeah. I think that's my point. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rombo. We can continue the conversation in the Q&A session. We are taking questions from the floor. Do we need to have the... Yes. Please do register with this, what do you call this? For the Q&A, scan first, and then your question will appear here, yeah? While waiting for some of the questions appear, I think we can take directly from the floor. I see Prof. Atiki and then Aldi down there. Prof. Atiki first.
Hi, my name is Al from this university. I'm teaching data science and also in the social science. I was wondering about the earlier comparison between Indonesia and Philippines, in that the Indonesian elites were more inward-looking compared to the Philippines elite. My question is, where does country like Singapore, where there's been some assertion about how there's a lot of capital flight going from Indonesian elites going there, and maybe regionally, what is your assessment about that? Is there any change about the Indonesian elites still being more very inward-looking, or does the rise of Singapore makes it more potential for capital flight, or is it limited to different ethnic of the elites? So yeah, this is my question.
Thank you. I think this is the question for Dr. Tajuddin. Yeah. Let's take the question first before we answer. Aldi, I think I saw Aldi up there raising his hand.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm Aldi. I'm from State University of New York at Albany, but I did my master's here. So my questions will go to Dr. Tajuddin, Zulfan Tajuddin. So I have three questions here. So, the first one, from the existing divergence and convergence in the Indonesia and Philippines, is there any causal mechanism that you are trying to explain that those existing conditions will have effect to the outcomes of inequality in Indonesia and the Philippines? And the second one, well, if it's only descriptive in explanation of the Philippinizations of Indonesia about the changing configurations, oligarchy in Indonesia, to what extent that has been happening, and under what conditions, such as because of dynasty politics or government accountability and other things. And lastly, from Indonesia and the Philippines, lessons from the historical period of authoritarianism and democratizations, like comparativist scholars suggest that there is no correlations or causations between democracy and development, or development to democracy. So from the experience of Indonesia and the Philippines, does democratic regime in Indonesia and Philippines is conducive enough to decrease or reduce the inequality? That's my question. Thank you.
I think Dr. Tajuddin can answer.
Okay, that's hard questions. Okay, on the first one, on the elite stake. I still believe that elite state means here the way the elite attached to the country and the way because of they're attached to the country, and then they do something. Imagine that the complaint from our fellow like in Bangladesh, for example. If the elite will need simple health treatment, they will simply fly to Singapore. They go to London. But in Indonesia, the Indonesian elite built hospital especially to treat the cancer. Built hospital to treat heart surgery. So this is something that is absent in country like Bangladesh. And somehow, so they are the elite, they are disengaged with the daily lives of the people. But in Indonesia, compared to Philippines, compared to Bangladesh, the elites have the stake in the country. This is on a positive look at the behavior of the elite. Of course, I understand that the complaints are many, but on the positive side. So now if we differentiate between two groups of oligarchs. One is the 9 Nagas, and then the other one, 9 Hajis, right? Then the shift from 9 Nagas to 9 Hajis, I'm sure that, culturally speaking, the 9 Hajis will be very much more attached to Indonesia. Probably the 9 Nagas will be very much enjoying Singapore, but come on, life in Singapore is not nice. I'm telling you, life in Indonesia is a lot nicer. You better to be Sultan in Indonesia rather than to live in high-rise luxury apartment in Singapore. Believe me, you will be bored after 1 week in high-rise building living in Singapore. Better to enjoy the Sultan life in Indonesia. You have your mansions, but you get out from your mansions, you have hell outside your mansions. So from that perspective, I think that is my point about the elite stake. So in terms of capital flight, of course, capital disappear. But in most cases, for Indonesia, relative to other countries, relative to the way the elite plunder the richness of African states, most of money will stay within the country. And the money will stay somewhere. If the money is in the bank, that will be loaned. If the money is put in different kinds of companies or even not profitable investment, still the money is running around. So that's still good. So I'm trying to be more positive about the elite in Indonesia. So on the last one, about the causal mechanism on the convergence, to be honest, I haven't done sufficiently enough study on this one. What I have been saying is basically very preliminary. So I cannot say the causal mechanism with confidence, but something that I quite strongly believe about the logic of the powerful political families with significant accumulations of wealth. So if public policy is controlled by these groups, generally speaking, public policy will be banned to serve their interests rather than serving the many. And it has been said that one of the reasons why the industrializations in the Philippines and the industrialization is not that deep compared to Indonesia, and the process of deindustrialization in the Philippines started way earlier than the deindustrialization in Indonesia. From the literature, one of the reasons was because of the elite control, because of the process of economic development in the name of industrializations did not serve the interests of the many, but rather the interests of the powerful elites. So compare that one with the way the powerful elites during Suharto, they are in fact part of the instrument for industrializations during the New Order. So from that perspective, you can see here some causal mechanism, how the combinations of powerful, rich, politically powerful and economically wealthy elite, we call it oligarchy now, and then how they are going not to serve the interests of the many, and then that to some extent will move toward capturing, regardless of the degree of the capturing the state itself. So I think that's one causal mechanism. Democracy and inequality, this is very interesting. Initially, democracy was meant to be for redistributions, but that promise has been denied. Not only in Indonesia, if you go to the most democratic country in the world, that kind of promise has been denied. So from that perspective, probably we just want to, what we are seeing in Indonesia about the rise of the powerful, politically powerful elite and economically wealthy, this is just to reinforce the more longer term of how Indonesia has been the typical poster child of many of the global trends. And oligarchy is probably the latest one.
Thank you, Dr. Tajuddin. I think we were asked, we're going to take some few more questions from the audience. Nobody has registered with this, yeah. So I'm just going to take from anyone. The gentleman in the back, would you be so kind, introduce yourself first?
All right, thank you. My name is Rafli. I am from Timor Network Foundations. We are an organization focused upon empowering Eastern Indonesia students who study in Jakarta. I have a very relevant question, and it's also a personal one as well, to Mr. Umbu. So a lot of us Eastern Indonesia students, we study here in Jakarta because of course, opportunities are driven here. All of the opportunities, basically income, it's better here. And we study here in ways to improve ourselves and then go back somehow. And we agree that many inequality challenges faced by Eastern Indonesia are closely linked to its geographical disadvantages. And some of us argue that it might be because of Indonesia's historically centralized approach of its government. And it might contribute to regional income disparities. And you call it inequality of income, we call it inequality of opportunities. It is the direct result of the income itself. And my question will be to Mr. Umbu and also to other speakers, probably because this is quite relevant. To what extent does Indonesia historically centralized approach to governing as such an archipelagic country contribute to its regional inequality and its inequality of opportunity in Eastern Indonesia? And what policy approaches could Indonesia adopt to ensure its decentralization translate into more equal access of economic, education, and social opportunities? Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. I think that's such a great question. Dr. Umbu can reply first, perhaps.
Yeah. Thank you, Pak. So Sulfan and I happened to be schoolmate back in undergraduate school, and also when doing master in development studies in the Netherlands, in the institute that is more leftist than many of the development school in Europe. However, in looking at the very fast geographic scattered of Indonesia, what you can see is that the this geographic, some may call it geographic disadvantage, right? But if the mining investors, the logging companies will see them as geographic opportunities, right? So I think opportunities is everywhere. However, the way we see who should steer or who should drive the development, actually, what I believe that in Indonesia, actually it is good for the indigenous people that the government-driven development does not drive them very strong, yeah, because of the I think because it is better for the indigenous people to go with the stream of community-driven development, right? They know better what they have. They know better what they're capable of. However, what I'm arguing is that there's been lack of willingness to change when it comes to cultural practices. Yeah. So if you see that actually Indonesian, the central government has conceded to high income sharing with the Papua government, right? Yeah. The Otsus from 2001, all the way until today. But what we see, there is changing in fiscal performance, fiscal revenue. However, there has been lack of programs that can be run to change this belief and the willingness of the people to change, and also for them psychologically to understand that they actually have the talent and they will be able to change if they want to. Yeah. So yeah, that's my take.
Thank you, Terumbu. Perhaps Professor Pirvander would like to take a stab on that question. To what extent regional disparity is a result of political centralization historically?
Yes.
Yes and no, perhaps.
Well, my background is in economic history, and I tend to think in very long-term perspectives, not even starting 1990, as I did in my presentation.
The mic is not working.
I think my microphone is on.
Oh, okay.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Not even going back to 1990, but even going back to the 1950s, if not 1900, if not 1870. All right. Now, this notion that you are referring to goes back to a process of decentralization that started in Indonesia already in 1904, which gradually took time to take shape. Plus, it also relates to the fact that certainly in the parts of Indonesia outside Java, there was a high degree of autonomy because in many regions the Rajas were still in charge. Yeah? Even though notionally the areas that they administered were part of what was called the Dutch East Indies, right? So there was a degree of autonomy in the past. And going back to well before the Second World War, yes, companies, private companies, whether Dutch or British or even ethnic Chinese controlled, they had to negotiate with the local authorities in order to gain access to resources. Right. So a process of decentralization existed already de facto, and it was taking shape de jure, as in the colonial state working towards gradually a process of reshaping a decentralized state. And of course that state took shape at an unfortunate moment in 1946. And that was unfortunate in the sense that in the late 1940s, there was suspicion among Indonesian nationalists that the Dutch colonial government that had just returned and tried to reimpose colonial rule had divide and rule as its imperative. This is what needs to be done in order to marginalize the Republic of Indonesia that had been declared on the 17th of August, and we're going to celebrate that, of course, on Monday, the 17th of August in 1945. So that was an unfortunate moment. Nevertheless, the Federation of Indonesia was declared, and it existed briefly until it came to an end in 1950 when the Republic of Indonesia, which was part of the Federation, unilaterally declared a unitary state again. And the consequence of that was that, for example, the local rulers, the Rajas that I just referred to, no longer had an absolute say in the matter. Decisions about how to control resources were made increasingly centrally in Jakarta. Now, in the 1950s, that wasn't so much of an issue, but it became an issue as, since the 1960s, other parts of Indonesia were opened up for new initiatives in business, in forestry, in palm oil, mining, etc. The decisions were made in Jakarta, so there were opportunities to find advantages by lobbying in Jakarta, as happened. Local rulers no longer had a say in that matter. In other words, it was a good suggestion. Maybe there is something in it, but it needs to be researched much further in order to substantiate that point. So thank you for the suggestion. More research can be done.
Thank you, Professor Pandeng. Well, please, warm applause for our presenters. We regret to inform, because of the interest of time, we have to close our first plenary session. Further engagement and questions, of course, can be asked to our presenters outside of the session. Thank you again for attending the first plenary session. Warm applause again for our presenters. Thank you, Professor Pandeng. Dr. Rumi. Thank you so much. Thank you, Pak.
Okay, distinguished guests, we'll now have a lunch break. I don't want to take too much of your time, but before we disband, please note that after lunch we'll begin the parallel sessions. So we encourage you to refer to the conference booklet for the location of each sessions. Please don't hesitate to reach out to our committee members in the green lanyard in case you get lost. And there will be 2 coffee breaks at 3 p.m. and 5 p.m. during the parallel sessions. To the VIPs, lunch will be held at the smart meeting room, in which you will be escorted by your liaison officers. To the other participants, I believe lunch is provided by the registration committee, so you could receive lunch directly at the entrance of this venue. To conclude, we will meet again at the gala dinner scheduled at 6:30 p.m. at the Procession Hall, Rectorate Building, 3rd floor. So enjoy your lunch, and I hope you have a productive session onwards. Have a great afternoon.